Okay, it is 8:55. Call our meeting to order today. First, we'll roll call and introduce yourselves and where you're from. I'm Jenna O'Farrell from St. Johnsbury.
Dan French, Secretary of Ed.
And Gleason from Essex. David Berkshire, student member, Williston.
John O'Keefe, Town of Manchester.
Peter Peltz, Woodbury.
Bill Mathis, Goshen.
Okay. Yeah, today we're at Lake Morey Inn, which is a beautiful Lake Morey, Lake Fairley, right, to look at today? It's Lake Fairley, right? Or Lake Morey?
Morey.
What's the name of the lake?
Morey.
Morey, okay. That was Fairley. In Fairley. And Mark Avery is a member of the St. Johnsbury School Board, and he is not in the room right now, but he's our host today. That's great to be here.
There is a Lake Farley nearby, by the way, if anyone wants to visit.
Okay, great. Good to know. I thought there was
Confirmed.
somewhere.
No, you're not all wet.
Thank you. It's just not that lake.
Yeah,
Got
it's
it.
not that one. Be a
Perfect.
long walk.
Okay. Any amendments to the agenda?
Yes. I would like to suggest we postpone Long Trail and East Meadow School till a little later in the agenda. Just remove them from the consent agenda.
Is that a motion? Or does it, do we have to motion that?
It's
I'm
the
gonna need a little help
decision
here.
that the chair can make.
So the motion is that we will move East Meadow and Long Trail out of the consent agenda into,
And the minutes, the consent agenda approved.
Second.
so I'm restating it now to say that we're moving those two schools over further into the agenda and the minutes are approved,
Can I,
right?
yep, before we vote, can I ask, what's the rationale for moving the
Yes.
two? You just have questions?
Well, yeah. There seems to be a discrepancy between the criteria in Long Trail versus East Meadow. I'm just wondering if it's a fair comparison, and just wanted to have some discussion on that.
Okay, we don't have to debate it anymore, right? Otherwise, we'll
No.
get into the matter.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I moved it,
Okay,
or seconded it.
so all in favor? Please say
Aye.
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 Okay, so we will be moving Long Trail and East Meadow into the other part of the agenda, and we just approved the board minutes. So, we're gonna skip the chair report until John joins us. And public to be heard. Do we have any public to be heard today? There's no public to be heard today. Moving on, AOE Data Strategy Plan Briefing with Wendy.
So good morning. We have two staff here from the state, Dr. Wendy Geller, who's the head of our data division, and Kevin Vignani.
Yeah.
Vianney, sorry. Kevin is our, basically a lead IT person, but Kevin's an employee of the Agency of Digital Services.
What agency again, please?
Agency of Digital Services?
Visual service?
Digital.
Digital service.
Yeah, there was a consolidation of IT functions at the state level a few years ago. But this presentation is sort of the last in a series of presentations. We started, Sabina, before you arrived on the board. The idea was to dig into a little bit about how we define education quality. So you might remember we had a few presentations on the education quality standards, just sort of foundational information. And then we moved into how we measure that. We looked at the snapshot, the school report card, and this is sort of the last piece of, what does the back end of all this look like in terms of how we collect, arrange, and visualize data at the agency and what the vision is going forward. So thank you guys for coming.
Absolutely. So, again, I'm Wendy, this is Kevin. So while Kevin does report up through the Agency of Digital Services, he and his crew are deployed to us. And so essentially Kevin and I function as a partnership at the agency of education. So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about my brand new division, the Data Management and Analysis Division, which was formed in So what you're gonna see here, I'm just gonna walk up to it because I don't have a pointer. What you see here in the left side of the screen is essentially how the organization has operated historically. Now this is definitely not the full body of data that the organization is responsible and accountable for collecting. It's just a small representation. But what you should be taking away from this is that there's lots of them, right? And they kind of exist in their own little discrete entities, right? And then what you see here in the middle are a lot of folks. You see a lot of arrows connecting these discrete data collections or data applications or platforms or tools to those folks who then connect it to the output. So what you're seeing here is an historical condition whereby the data collections, the data infrastructure themselves, right, have been held together by people, those people in the middle. And what this kind of gives us on a basic level is that we have like a point-to-point historical system that folks are holding together.
Can you clarify, is this just generally statewide, or is this particular to the agency?
This is particular to the agency, but that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. This is not a condition that is unique to the Agency of Education. This is a condition that we see in all across state government, not just in Vermont. We see this in a lot of other states. We see it at the federal level. Honestly, we see conditions like this in private sector sometimes too, right? But to clarify, no, we're specifically talking about the infrastructure conditions at the AOE, but the general conditions of having like a point-to-point infrastructure that's heavily manual, that's not unique to us. So there's a super heavy reliance on the data folks, right? The data program staff. Oftentimes what you'll see is you'll have one particular subject matter expert who performs a series of tasks, right? Who's conducting that workflow, right? And that's by and large the only person who has the expertise, access to those data and the requisite tools to do the work that's needed to be done. This is very labor intensive. I think we can infer from all of the wild vines, right? There's a lot going on there. And if you have bottlenecks that have to move through people, right? That's a very high burden for being able to execute your daily work. So what is our assessment of current or legacy state, right? By legacy state, what we mean are the historical conditions that lead up to now. What we've observed is that there's a very disjointed approach to both the tool and the skill modernization efforts across the IT and the data teams respectively, right? What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that we're not all, historically we have not all been oriented toward a particular series of tools. We have not historically been engaging in professional development in a unified strategic fashion together. So going forward, we're going to have this shared approach to the modernization effort. Establish standards for skills, established and standard tool sets that can be deployed as part of how we function and do our work. There are lots of disjointed and disparate points of data collection. If you remember back to the slide that we just looked at, they're all kind of siloed, right? They're all discrete and siloed. What we need to move towards is having very standard operating procedures for the manner in which we collect data as a whole. This is good for several reasons. The first being which that it establishes a collective body of knowledge and kind of a baseline for how we operate. Internally, that's a win. It brings coherence and cohesiveness to a certain body of work. Externally for the field, that's also a win because you establish a basic way that they can expect to engage with the organization. So it essentially increases the predictability of what that experience is going to look like, and you can build routine into that. Historically, we've had a lot of non-integrated data sets. What does that mean? That means that they've lived separately, and then you have to engage in manual, or folks have to do the work of bringing those data together, right? In the future, we're moving towards unified master data management to facilitate that data integration. That's a lot of technical jargon. What that means is that we need to engage in very careful mapping and integration work so that those many different formerly siloed data collections can live together and be leveraged. We haven't historically had a single unified data model. A data model is where your data live. It's the logic that hold your data together. It's all the rules that you apply to say this record can be connected to that record for this reason. We haven't had that before. Moving forward, we are going to be adopting the federally established Common Education Data Standards Normalized Data Schema. We're going to get into that in just a little bit. What I need you to take away from this is that this integrates those data into one place where they can talk to each other, and where lots of folks, as opposed to one person here who hangs on to this data, one person here who hangs on to these other pieces of data, where those lots of folks and their data can work on them together and use them together. Historically, there's been what we friendly, in a congenial term, have called patchy, non-standard process documentation. How do you know what you're supposed to do if you haven't written down how to do it? So just like what we showed you in that first slide, where you have people holding together processes, if those folks don't have a common language, if they don't have a common shared way in which they're writing down the steps and the means by which they execute their work, it's pretty hard to share your work with other folks, right? It's also pretty hard to say I want to go on vacation, right? I would love to go on vacation, by the way, sir. Say I can't. Okay, thanks. Duly noted. Say I want to go on vacation, but I haven't written down my workflow in a way that Kevin can read, that Kevin could then help me out with to try to get ready for my vacation so I could be done with my workflow before I go on vacation, right? What happens if I get sick and I need to be out? If I haven't written down my workflow, that's a pretty big risk to the organization, right? That's a pretty big barrier to somebody like Kevin, who's wonderful, and would be like, hey, Wendy, I'll pick up the ball for you. How can Kevin pick up the ball if he doesn't even know where it is? So this has been critical. Going forward, well, actually this is another part of this bullet. Non-uniform application of governance. Data governance are the rules of the road. It's how we do our work. It's essentially the standards and the guidelines by which we execute on the operational functions of the agency. So this bullet aligns to these two. Just want to keep it really logical here. Moving forward, we are centrally managing all of the governance. This is a big task, but if we don't do this, we can't do any of the other work downstream. We need to have a shared language. We need to have shared and collectively understood standards. We need to establish a body of knowledge for how we execute and do our work on an operational basis. Historically, we've had pretty heavy reliance on what are called in the technical field non-scalable processes. What does that mean? Non-scalable means that they're discrete. It's like those folks that you saw on that first slide. They have really specific processes that they've developed to do their work, right? If we're not sharing a language, if we're not sharing basic standards, how do you apply processes that could probably be pretty useful to lots of other folks who need to do the data work at the organization if you're only doing that in one place, right? So non-scalable is resource intensive and it's burdensome. Another way to think about this is, has anybody ever called up like your doctor's office to talk about making an appointment, or maybe you need to talk about a prescription that you have? Do you have to talk to the same person every single time that you call? Or can you talk to whoever it is that answers the phone and they can get in and say, yeah, no problem, we'll schedule you for Thursday, right? If you don't have scalable processes, you're having to call and talk to the same person every single time, right? By having a system that is shared by which all the folks that you call up about your appointment or your prescription or whatever it is, right? They can get in there. You're saving time, right? And it's not so heavy and person-centric. So going forward, everything is scalable, everything is portable, everything needs to be repeatable. We should not be having discrete, ad hoc, labor-intensive processes to hold the organization together. Again, historically, we have this heavy reliance on that manual work just to keep the lights on. Now, AOE is accountable for a vast corpus of compliance required reporting. If the burden is so heavy just to keep the lights on, how do you get to a place where you're actually able to interrogate those data and leverage them to answer tougher questions that are not absolutely required just to meet basic compliance? In the future, the goal is to automate the production of all compliance reporting. That stuff's pretty stable on an annual basis, right? You usually know what those criteria are. Automate the production of all of those compliance reporting. Stand up interactive dashboards. Has anybody ever used a dashboard before? Maybe folks have seen things like Tableau or Power BI, or maybe you've used an Excel sheet and made like a pivot table or what have you, right? Okay, we're going to be standing up interactive dashboards for the program folks and eventually for the public. Creating slack in the system. What that means is reducing the burden on the compliance reporting enough that there's room for creativity, that there's room for building value-added products. If you can hold it till the end, I just want to make sure that we get through all of the content. I know that we're going to have questions and I want to have a conversation, but I want to make sure we get this to you guys. So, historically, we've also had the data stewards, the analysts, and the specialist teams federated all across the organization, right? Today, moving forward, the data stewards, the analysts, and the specialists are centrally unified in one division. That has never existed at the agency before. So Kevin is going to talk a little bit about how this, about how we're going to move forward with how our infrastructure actually functions now. Do you want me to hit the buttons?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so Wendy has just laid out kind of a current assessment and then a vision for moving forward. And really, we're tackling this in two major components. The first is infrastructure, the IT infrastructure to make this happen. And then the second is the focus on the data process, which Wendy will get into a little bit later. So if you remember back to one of our first slides, simply it's the same slide. We've replaced people with processes. And essentially, I wish it was that simple. It's not. But the idea here is that we're leveraging the knowledge in the program staff to build hardened process, to move data into a data environment, and then tie it to reporting needs. So what the heck does that mean? Well, we know we're going to have changes in what we're asked to report on and how we're asked to manage data around education. We know our outputs are relatively stable, but we want to do more, both on the analytics side as well as be able to do more state-based reporting. So we know both of those pieces are going to change. So for us, our focus is at building this integration platform to help us manage those inputs and outputs. So what that allows us to do is be focused on the data itself and not necessarily the applications that we've built around programs. It also positions us in a place, this is not resistant to change, this is resilient to change. So it is accepting the fact that everything, both at the reporting end and on the source data sources, are going to evolve and we're going to be changing. It gives us a place to make those changes and keep our system operating properly. And then something that Wendy already talked a little bit about, it allows us to free program staff to focus on the programs that they're supposed to be running and not managing the data to inform those programs. Okay, so that's simply done. How do you do it? Well, part of this is adopting the common data model that Wendy referred to, the SEDS data model. And you're not supposed to take anything away from this. Just know that at the national level, folks have spent a lot of time building this schema for proper optimal storage of information around education. And what this will allow us to do is have a common language with internal staff, but also with vendors that we work with. So if we work with any contracts, we're able to specify a data standard. It allows us to be much more plug and play with products or reporting that comes out of it. The other thing moving to a common data model helps us do is the feds have done a lot, the Federal Agency of Education has done a lot of work around products that work off of this common data model. So by us moving into there, we're able to open ourselves up to sharing at the federal as well as with other states that are building products. Nope. Okay, and I had to include this slide just because Wendy really liked how flashy it is.
I got a little crazy with the Visio, and I thought it would be fun. You don't have to take anything away from the right-hand side. Essentially, what we're trying to help folks know is that we're not going it alone any longer. By adopting all those federal tools, we have a fundamental leg up, and we're able to capitalize on the development talent that exists and considerable R&D that has been invested at the federal level and also nationally across all of the states who do adopt those and contribute to those standards. So, yeah, I like Visio.
So, and the reason why this is important is because we talked a little bit about the data, but also there's a cost to managing this data, right, and to owning this data. For us, we've built infrastructure around programs. So you have a need, you would build an application, you would build storage, you would build your processes around that program. What we're talking about today is building infrastructure that allows you to roll programs into it, right? And so thinking of it slightly differently, being able to leverage economy of scale to support reduction of cost, but also being able to have a platform which you can easily roll new reporting or new products into. So just to summarize that piece, so for the infrastructure that we're working on today, it is common data storage, common data schema, as well as building out a larger a more agnostic infrastructure to be able to support multiple programs in one environment. What the hope of all this is IT being able to provide a platform that then Wendy's team, as the experts in the data management, can then operate on and continuously improve on. So I'll let Wendy finish.
So this is all sounding probably pretty overwhelming at this stage. So we always kind of come back to the questions about this stuff with regard to like, how do you actually do it? I don't know, does anybody watch the IT Crowd or have they seen the IT Crowd? If you haven't, I highly recommend. It's a British comedy. This is an iconic scene from the show where Moss, who is one of the stars, there's a fire down in their IT office, right? And this is a fire extinguisher that Moss has, and it's definitely on fire as well. And Moss says this line that, I mean, they've made t-shirts about this, where he says, I'll just put this over here with the rest of the fire, right? Like, so how do we do any of this? We've talked about some pretty lofty goals. How do we do any of this? What we're gonna do over the next series of slides is talk with you about how, right? What need to be the priorities, what's already been done, and we're gonna show you some of the discrete and very concrete work that has already been done, and then where we need to go going forward, okay? So on a very basic level, right, Data Management and Analysis Division never existed before October of last year, right? So we're still new, coming up on our 1 year, just to remind that, right? Kevin, my wonderful partner, arrived in March, right? So in the last number of months, Kevin worked with me on some work that I had already kind of had underway. And collectively, right, because one of our first goals is that we need to make sure that we're partnering with those ADS partners, right? We need to modernize. We need to modernize, and that needs to be a big priority. So thinking about what we have called 3 to 5 year breakthrough objectives, right? These would be game changers. These are objectives that represent a fundamental shift in advancing the data and technical infrastructure both at the agency and in how we do education data as a state. We need to move from this reactive culture to a proactive culture, adopting a posture of innovation and continuous improvement, effectively coordinating our resources, right, so that we can execute on what are called cross-functional workflows. So we stop having those single folks handling the entire life cycle of a process, collaborating, and moving work across teams effectively. Strengthening our security posture and our privacy posture. This is critical. The data we work with on a daily basis are extremely sensitive, and we take our responsibilities to privacy very seriously. Empowering the program folks, empowering the field with their data. If we're crushed by the basic things that it takes to keep the lights on, how do we ever come to a space of value add? One of the first and most concrete ways that we've moved in this direction is that we went from being 4 teams federated across the organization to one work family. We call ourselves that. That's how we've named ourselves. So in a very brass tacks kind of a way, we're together now. Being together matters for working together, for collaborating, for finding better ways to do things. We're better together. We also need to partner with our extended work family, our ADS partners, right? Our Agency of Digital Services partners. This is a different agency. They're deployed to us. They're folks with critical skills who handle the technical infrastructure that we need to do our jobs, right? We better be good partners. We got to solve some hard problems. How do we do that? Fundamentally, this is about how we work together. We've adopted lean practices. Lean comes out of the Toyota methodology. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this. This is really just a different language on this right-hand side with the continuous improvement cycle. Many of you will probably know this from the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, or Plan, Do, Check, Act. Many of you are probably already familiar. This is just another way to say it. This is a methodology, but it's also a culture that's oriented toward interrogating what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. We should always be looking for ways, even if they're small, to do things better. This is a practice whereby you actively have to engage in reviewing your processes. We need to be identifying what we're doing, measuring how well we're doing it, and then figuring out where we stand to pull on a lever to improve what's happening. It's also an environment where we speed up what are called feedback loops. And what that means is we know earlier what's working and what's not working. How can we know any of that if we don't actually know what we're doing and we don't have a shared language and we don't have our processes documented in a way that another partner might be able to read them, right? So a couple of years ago, when I was in a much more junior position, I led a team called the Data Analysis and Reporting Team in the agency. It was about 3 years now. We embarked on our lean journey. And one of the first steps that we took was to learn a practice called Kanban. Kanban is Japanese. It just means a card. What I'd like you to take away from this is that this is an actual screenshot of some of our process documentation on the right-hand side of the screen. In Kanban practice, you write down what you do. You come together with the other folks who have to do that work. You establish and identify what that work is. You define it in a very standard way so that you can share and understand one another when you're talking about what types of work you're doing. You then visualize the work. How many of us ever use sticky notes? Yeah? A Kanban board doesn't have to be digital. It just has to have some lines that say, I got to do this. I'm doing it right now. Oh, maybe it's stuck someplace. I'm waiting on somebody else. This is completely tailor-made to how you do your process, right? And is it done? I like to crumple my sticky notes up and throw them in the recycling when it's done because it feels very good. I obviously participate in the digital environment as well, but the point is that this doesn't have to be technologically centric. It's about the practice of how we do this, right? If you can see your sticky note, it's a good reminder, right? The purpose of Kanban is that you see your work. You visualize your work. Visualizing the process then for doing the work. Sometimes, I'm pretty sure folks have experienced where you need to rely on somebody else to do a certain part of your work so that you can get it done, right? If we visualize the work together, say I have a responsibility that I then have to, okay, I'm done with my part, I need to hand it to Kevin to get it done. If Kevin can see it and we can work on it together, that task is gonna get done. We're not gonna forget about it. It also helps us identify waste in the process, right? If something is stuck for a long period of time, it kind of makes you think, why is it stuck? Why is it taking so long to get to done? Well, maybe so-and-so's out sick. Maybe such and such forgot that it was on their desk, right? That's waste in the system. Go and address the fact that it's on their desk, or think about how you're doing your handoff so that you can move more quickly. Address the waste in the process, then actually do it, right? Make an adjustment, be willing to do things differently, and follow through. Clarity, find better ways, repeat. So what I'm showing you here, this is another actual screenshot of how we do our work at the moment. We came together collectively in my little team at the time, and we said, what does it take, just bar none, what does it take to get this particular type of work done? Spent a couple, spent an hour or so to write it all down, and said, hey, this is like the template now. This is how we're all going to collectively agree to do our work. This is a more advanced screenshot. You're going to need to tailor it up or tailor it down, depending on the specificity of the workflow. Sometimes you need steps in one workflow you don't need in a different workflow. One size isn't going to fit all, but you all need to have a baseline to start from that you've collectively agreed upon you need to be able to move forward. So to know where to go, we got to kind of know where we are first, right? So through this Kanban implementation over the last couple of years, we've been able to identify bottlenecks, find barriers to these workflows, figure out, like, what is waste in the system? Is it time? Is it quality issues where we have to do work again? Is it, somebody's stuck because they didn't share their code, right? We're able to then deploy resources to eliminate those issues. In a resource-constrained environment, you need to be resourceful, right? Repeat. So what you're seeing here now, what we've talked about until now in the Kanban environment has been the very discrete task documentation that is very, very important for the folks who are executing on the work, okay? What I'm showing you here is a screenshot of a managerial level dashboard that I've built in a tool called Power BI, part of the Microsoft stack. What I built here is based on an aggregation, right, a summing of the data from the Kanban environment that my small team built. This enables me to examine the data that our Kanban environment produces about how we do our work, so that I, as the leader, can make strategic decisions about how I deploy resources across my team to ensure that we can execute on workflows across the calendar year. Now, I realize it's small print, right, in some places, but what you're seeing here, this is a January to December, is flows of particular types of work. How many hours have to be spent on particular types of work, right? What do I have to do as the manager, right? What do I have to do as the leader of this brand new division to be able to make sure that I can strategically deploy enough resources to handle this workflow ahead of this workflow? And I know about that because we took the time to pay attention to our process and what we were doing. So we have fundamentally moved from an environment of, remember our first slide, where we had these very siloed, disparate, unconnected, right, processes held together by folks who were not together, right? Not only have we moved from a space of ad hoc reactive firefighting, we've moved to a place of being able to leverage data on workflows that in the past were never documented. We have data on those workflows now that I can strategically deploy to more intelligently manage our resources and start paying down that very considerable technical debt that has been able to accrue at the organization. Now, coming back to some of our breakthrough objectives, right, which have to do with partnering with our extended work family, Kanban was an environment that was only used by my folks, right, my little team, before I became the division director, before we formed the division, right? That's not scalable. If it's only used, right, if it's only used by one group, it's not shared by many, how do you scale? So what we're doing now is we're graduating to an environment, holds the same principles, it's just a much more sophisticated and robust tool set. It operates with the Microsoft stack. What I want you to take away from this is that we're graduating to an environment where not only we will deploy this across my entire division, but we are capable of functioning in an integrated fashion with our ADS partners on a daily basis. So the work that Kevin and his crew do to execute on their responsibilities will be visible and integrated because we do work very hand in glove. Will be integrated with all of the work that my crew executes on a daily basis. So to give you a sense, and I'm not going to ask you to read this, right? PowerPoint, death by PowerPoint. But I do want, because I realize that you're going to get these as printouts, if you want to return to this, what I want you to take away from it is that every single breakthrough objective maps to a discrete and concrete project or workflow, and we maintain key performance indicators on how we're doing in executing that work. My division practices a methodology called Hosh and Conry strategic planning. This is a very established methodology. It's particularly useful for new organizations or organizations that have to bring together folks who need to be able to see how they fit in the larger vision. They need to be able to see in very traceable, concrete ways how their work is connected to the strategic direction of the organization, right? For us, our organization is our brand new division, and our broader organization is obviously education data across the state of Vermont. So, fun reading, maybe not fun reading. I think it's fun reading. I'm very proud of what we've been able to do in under a year. And I'm gonna segue to Kevin to wrap it up.
Okay, so just before we leave, because we know we've thrown a lot of vision and a lot of technical terms at you, I just wanted to summarize that we have three main focus areas. The first is to adopt standardization in both data practice, processes, and infrastructure, and move to leveraging as much of the publicly available or shared with other states type tools that are out there. Establish a framework that we continuously improve upon and move some of that organizational knowledge out of people and into a community of people at the organization. And then, as Wendy gave that great example of calling the doctor, is to scale those processes so that it's not reliant on individuals to make these processes work.
So thank you so much for holding your questions. We just wanted to open it up to anything that you might want to ask or converse about.
So I have another question that I apologize that came in late, but going back to your architectural diagram, can you, and you may have, apologies, you may have already said this, but how many separate data stores do you have today?
Oh my gosh.
Just ballpark.
It depends what you would define as a data store. One of the challenges we have at the organization is they're not all applications that are IT supported,
Yep.
right? There's a lot of ad hoc survey tools, there's access databases,
Yeah.
there's spreadsheets
Yeah.
on people's.
In terms of your universe for data analysis, what's the rough size of the universe that you work with in terms of the separate number of data stores?
So again, I just want to make sure we're speaking the same
Yep.
language. There is no integrated data store that exists at the organization.
Oh, yeah, no, I know, so I'm trying to get an understanding of how many different data sources you're
Data
pulling.
sources,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. Wow, dozens and dozens and dozens.
Yeah,
That's part of the issue, right?
Yeah.
And so, just to recap, again, to make sure we're all on the same page. So historically, right, the organization has kind of spun up bespoke responses to new reporting requirements,
Yeah.
new rules or guidance, right?
yeah,
So also just out of the crack of the bat, everybody knows that Vermont is a compliance state, right?
yeah,
So what that means is that we don't collect any data that are not mandated by the federal government, the state government, or by some rule or policy or guideline, right? So we don't collect anything that we are not absolutely responsible and accountable to collect. So
Is that true?
historically,
sorry to push back, but is that true? Because I've queried the previous secretary on that very point. Because in the past, there's been data collected that have been presented, and I've queried what the rationale was for it, the underlying rule, et cetera, and wasn't able to get an answer.
I can't speak to questions that
Okay.
were asked of a different
Yeah,
person.
yeah, but I would, and we can take it offline, but I would
Sure.
suggest that I'm not entirely sure that that's.
I'm happy to take it
Yeah.
offline. with
That's
you.
the vision going forward.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
Let us
happy to
know
take
so
it
we can
offline.
stop it.
Yeah.
So again, just at the beginning, to make sure that folks who may have missed it, right? The organization historically has taken a very ad hoc approach to things like data collection and data management. And so, like what Kevin was talking about earlier, where we need to be able to scale, right? Scaling infrastructure. It is very burdensome and it is very expensive to not have a unified and coherent and cohesive means by which we do that. And if we build infrastructure that is exclusively targeted on these very, very, very small, discrete processes, it becomes hard, A, to manage them, and B, to use them in conjunction with other data that exists at the organization, right? So we need to move away from this very discrete, one-off building efforts and move towards an infrastructure that is flexible enough to be able to ingest, right, take in lots of different types of data and then integrate them with the larger corpus of data that exists and is stewarded at the organization. Does that help?
And yes, that's a follow-up question. So when you say stewardship, that brings to mind data governance. I assume data governance rests within your organization? Is there formally defined data governance?
There are staff who engage in data governance at this time. That's an area that I'm working on in terms
Okay.
of resourcing and support. I'd be happy to talk to you
Okay.
about that offline, but in an environment.
Sounds like that's a little bit shaky, right? That's a to-be state.
Well, you know, in an environment of scarce resources, we have to make sure that we're deploying to the greatest need.
Yeah.
I am a deep believer in the importance of data governance. I'm also a deep believer in having to be realistic about how many hours there are in the week and how many folks I have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
fill those hours. Yeah.
So go back to the various disparate systems, and I think it's fair to say you're always gonna have disparate systems, so and this goes back to the architecture diagram that I came in at. I don't know if I was looking for it, but it was a little fuzzy, so I couldn't see it clearly represented, but I assume you're moving towards some sort of a data warehouse architecture.
We're
Yeah.
adopting the Common Education Data Standards Normalized Data Schema.
Okay,
This is a federally developed model.
Yeah.
The feds push the update scripts. Whenever they do update the model, it is a fully extensible model. Vermont will only be extending the model insofar as we absolutely need to. And that's because when you tailor something, it becomes more work
Yeah.
to manage it. And so, yes, we are moving towards a single data schema
Yeah.
to build an integrated environment at the organization.
but but you're going to continue to have separate data stores, databases that publish into this data warehouse in this common schema, or is the goal to eliminate all of these separate databases and move everything into a common database?
No. So so it's a great question because I think that was the thinking of past. And what really we're trying to do is, right, so you establish your data warehouse, or in this case, it's a data lake,
Data
right?
lake,
And what you're doing is you're acknowledging that those source data sets are going to, 3 years are going to go by, we'll have to be competitive, there'll be another application,
Yeah.
the environment will change, we'll have to record something else, right? So we're acknowledging that that's happening, and what that, instead of doing that point-to-point integration, we're isolating ourselves from downstream effect.
Yeah.
And so you're saying, I know things are going to change. We're going to work on this standard as the middle stake in the ground here. And then we can be flexible. If there's a product we don't like,
Yeah.
we can say, okay, this isn't working for the state. We're going to go to something new. Here's the spec for that data standard that we want to fulfill.
Yeah.
How much of our data is on-prem versus in the cloud?
So we don't really have, so we have, the state manages a virtual network. So basically we have our own state cloud. The majority of our servers, actually I think probably about 90% of our servers at AOE are actually in the cloud managed by the state, so it's kind of like a
Private cloud, yeah.
private cloud, right? We also have a couple big pieces of infrastructure that we're starting to move to the Azure cloud, the Gov cloud.
Yeah.
And so we'll kind of be a mix of both private and public cloud for
Okay.
duration.
Thanks.
Raises
Mr.
bunch
Matthews.
of questions, one of which is, you want to integrate things, but yet at the same time, you're going out to the other agency for data collection and so forth. That's the problem. The other thing that got me in terms of the presentation was I didn't know that you could get print that's this small. And so I really don't have any idea what the substance of this is. It's just a great deal of process. And I'm looking for something more concrete than what we've got here, which is basically a planning model. And then it gets to the staffing question, you know, if you have to hand the ball off to Kevin, well, Kevin is juggling 10 other balls. So what do you do for capacity? How much did the governor increase your budget in this area for the past year, and what do you expect in the future?
So I want to clarify your first question. You mentioned going to other agencies for data collections. Which ones are you referring to?
No, I'm talking about this general data collection for all of state government. What do you call it?
I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. Can you help me
Okay, there's
understand your
this
question a little better?
Department of Digital Services or something
Oh,
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Oh, the Agency of Digital Services, yes, the governor created the Agency of Digital Services a couple of years ago. He basically centralized the reporting structure for all of the IT personnel. Those personnel remained embedded at the agencies that they were working at before. It's just a different reporting structure geared toward trying to achieve some efficiencies with things. I mean, things like licensing, I know you all have had some real savings with.
Yeah, so the idea is that we centralize the core functions, right? So server management, security management, EA and project management staff, all those things are held at the central office. The embedded staff still function as day-to-day IT support, database administration, application support, and even the in-house development work that we do. So other states have gone both ways, as you're probably familiar, centralized or federated, and there's trade-offs to both. And we have found there to be a sweet spot in keeping some of those core and some of those out in the field. So as far as impact on this project, what that would mean for this project, so first of all, I want to reiterate that 99% of the data work is done by Wendy's team. So our role is really in establishing the databases that support that, the integration, hardening the integration packages that her team is developing the logic for, and then connecting those to presentation tier. I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
That's the division of labor, more or less.
Well, there's lots of opportunities for doing this kind of thing, not being coordinated, and that's a great danger.
Sure is. That's why one of our primary efforts, right, if you recall, and I realize that, you know, pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? We really need to partner well with our extended work family. And that's a commitment that I think we're definitely serious about and are executing on. So, I'm sorry, I
Well,
realize
that's
you've raised your hands a few
basically what I'm
times.
interested in, particularly in the interagency. I mean, you must have to share some data IT business with the human services, that is AOE. I mean, how much is this being coordinated, and is it all compatible and happening, you know?
So I think I'm going to say back to you what I think that you're asking me, and you tell me if I understood the question correctly. I think that you're asking me whether or not AHS has been engaged with this work, Am I?
I would assume you must be working with AHS on some level in terms of data and sharing, and that's what I'm asking. Is
We
this?
share data with AHS pretty regularly.
But are they going through the same transformation that AOE is?
Yeah, so right now, as far as centralized data, AHS, AOT, and AOE are the three major groups working towards centralized data management. That doesn't mean that everything gets lumped in the same place. But we're sharing the structure, we're sharing kind of how and the methodology we're doing to get there. And we all have slightly different needs, but it's similar. And that's one of the efficiencies of standardizing those core functions, is that this isn't just ADS at AOE coming up with this.
Right.
This is looking at the other agencies and working with the other folks in the other groups.
And what's the
Yeah.
timeline on this in terms of until it's fully implemented or as close as you?
Well, I put together a 3 to 5 year strategic plan that is with my leadership at the moment. So far, what I can say is that, and you jump in, Secretary French, if you think
Yeah.
I'm misspeaking, but
No, go for
my
it.
secretary is fully behind all of the work that I have done to date and believes in my leadership, and that's why I'm here with you today.
And when was that implemented? When did you start this 3 to 5 year plan? Was that, or is that just starting? That,
So in the last, we're coming up on just 1 year of
Mhm.
having even formed the division. Over the last year, to be prudent and think about what are we actually dealing with here? Because there has never been an enterprise level engagement with what our data and infrastructure actually, like the conditions actually are. So the first out of the gate, we've spent these last 11 months really taking a hard look at current state, which we've talked about here, right? And now these next 12 to 18 months are implementing our highest priority efforts. And I realize that this is very tiny print, but the slide on the year one work will get into more of the discrete nitty gritty of what that very specific work and projects were associated with that. The strategic plan is with my leadership at the moment. In the grand scheme of things, I'm sure we'll need to make certain adjustments based on staffing and budgeting and et cetera. But we needed to have a very good sense of what are we inheriting, what are we looking at, what is the work.
will that include hiring? There are IT vacancies, aren't there? Are there going to be new hires to support this?
I don't know the answer to that right now. I have a vacancy posted at the moment, which I'm very excited about. I've had some really wonderful folks join my crew in the last year, so that's really great. I know you are just now fully staffed, right?
Yeah, staff turnover is gonna be something that we deal with. And I think part of what this model is getting the work so that folks can come into this environment and add value quickly. Because turnover has been an issue, both in IT and in the data team. So, yeah, I don't think it's something that will ever be, she says fully staffed, but,
Yeah.
that may last a week or two, I don't know.
Current state. I mean, like, we're also, I think it's very important to couch some of this discussion in the broader sociodemography of the state, right? Like, we're an aging state. Folks get to retire. I mean, that's, folks get to retire. They get to do that. By doing this work, we are orienting the organization to be more resilient, and we're orienting the organization to be able to succession plan and have continuity of operations in a way that has not occurred before. So, do you want to ask a question?
No, you go first, and I already have.
I was just going to acknowledge, I don't speak this language at all. Although I do know from sitting in different positions and working with state agencies, that people who are actually doing work are going to hugely benefit and appreciate the work that you're doing behind the scenes, because it is nightmarish to manage grants or different programs and have to do 6 different spreadsheets, and you're collecting data points that don't correlate to actually making plans to improve practices. So I don't really understand everything at your level at all. I just know that the output hopefully will lead to stronger practices for people doing work, real work, and would really appreciate the output.
That's the goal.
That's the goal. Absolutely.
So comment and a question is, I want to go back to some of what Peter was bringing up, and just a level set for this group, when it comes to staffing, we should exercise a great deal of deference to these guys, because they have enormous challenges hiring people and qualified people. And I'll just put it out there, and not to sound glib, but their most senior, I can guarantee you, their most senior people that they have make less than what a graduate fresh out of college is going to make in Silicon Valley. And that makes your recruiting for these types of positions incredibly difficult.
Thank you for saying that.
So,
That's true.
yeah, this is my world, I live in it, so I know the numbers, I know the challenges, dealing with that. But so question for you, just going back to the shift from reactive to proactive, can you tell us a little bit about where you're at today and how much time it's going to take you to get to a world where you can be more predictive in your analytics? And like, are you guys experimenting or doing anything with like k-means clustering or any sort of sophisticated predictive analysis?
Thank you for asking the question. I took this job because that's what I thought that I should be doing. That is not the work right now, because we historically have not scaffolded the organization in order to have enough slack in the system to engage in that work. The EdFacts reporting, for example, alone are well over 100 files a year. That's just EdFacts, and that is a tiny fraction of the body of data that we are accountable to report to the federal government and to the state, to the web, at the moment. It is an absolute goal, and I think I capture that with empowering folks with the data. We need to create slack in the system before we can start working on the want-tos. We have to be able to efficiently execute on all of the have-tos before we have room to do the want-tos. I would love to say in 2 years that is where we will be. We have to execute on the basics well and consistently, and we need to have the kind of infrastructure that can automate all that compliance reporting to reduce the burden in order to have enough room to do that. I absolutely have staff members who are capable and have the training to do that and even more sophisticated analyses, multi-level modeling, structural equation modeling in general. Factor analysis is certainly, in there. I have some really brilliant folks. If those folks are crushed by what it takes to keep the lights on, there's no room to blossom. There's no room to do that.
And they're gonna leave.
They will, you're right. I have been very fortunate in that my work family is very stable. I have been, we use that term very seriously. We are a work family. We have a wonderful environment in my crew that we're very proud of. We laugh every day, and when the work is as hard and messy as this is, you really need to cultivate a sense of humor. So I'm very fortunate in the people that I have. What we can say have been advances in this area are our capacity to actually leverage data on how we do the work, so that I, as their leader, can make strategic decisions about how I support them best through the calendar year, how I message upwards to my leadership about there is no room for X if we're going to have to do A, B, and C. What's going to come off the plate? And they have been responsive. Secretary French has certainly been responsive in saying, I take your recommendation seriously. We're going to do E, F, and G. Please execute. So what we have been able to do in the strategic end of things is leverage the data about how we are working so that we can start to pay down some of that technical debt. And by technical debt, what I mean is legacy systems, outdated tools that really remember in the very beginning where you have all those folks in the middle who are like, who's seen the Spider-Man movie where he's like holding the two halves of the ferry boat together, right? Like that's what this has been like for these folks historically, right? You need the right tools for the right job. I mean, anybody who's ever hung drywall knows that you're not going to use a screwdriver, right? If we keep forcing folks to use screwdrivers to try to hang the drywall, we're never going to get to k-means clustering and multi-level modeling. We need to get the impact driver out. that's what we need to do. Sorry for folks who are not into house projects. My husband and I have a very old house. Needs a lot of work. And you know what? It's like a metaphor for this job, really, because you ever opened up a wall? You're like, this is a small project, right? You're like, I'm just going to do this little piece of this project, and you open that wall of the house up, and you're like, oh, okay, so the plumbing. All right, so I guess we're doing plumbing today too, right? / 3 weeks of plumbing. You know, oh, look, the electrical. I guess the electrical really needs it too. Okay, I guess we're doing another 4 weeks of electrical. And the insulation, by the way, right? So this is the same kind of a process that this has been over these last 11 months, right? It has been the process of, all right, let's roll up these sleeves and take the wall down. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. That doesn't mean that we should shy away from what this work is and what it's going to be. It's going to be hard. It's going to be messy. It's going to be tough. We cannot do this by ourselves. We need to engage collaboratively with our partners, right? We need to engage with the field, right? We need to do it because it's hard. We need to do it because it's hard. Does that help?
Actually, it helps a lot. The drywall thing, I can really relate. And when you have a piece that just falls down on top of you,
I know,
that's
right?
a lot
I
of
think she's
fun.
talking horsehair plaster. And
It's horsehair plaster. It's been like, we've got a really good way that you can, the old asbestos roofing. I'll talk to you later, but my husband is a genius.
Well, that's a preface to how do we change from an environment of continuous feedback loops that drive adjustments and improvements to yield more value. What's that mean in drywall hanging?
Well, I'm going to go get the impact driver first. That is definitely for sure. Right tool for the right job, right? We need to move away from legacy tools that were not designed to handle large bodies of data. A lot of the infrastructure at the AOE has been held together with things like Access databases, the statistical package for the social sciences, things like, so those were kind of, there's an old Oracle environment. I don't want to get like too far into the nitty gritty because I know that that's not really what you're here to talk
What
about
are you
today.
using SPSS for?
Sorry?
What are you using SPSS for?
As little as possible now. Well, historically, that was the only software package that was available to kind of manipulate.
Yeah.
It's not an appropriate tool to be engaging in large-scale data manipulation, especially when it's like regularly scheduled maintenance or data management efforts. You really need something like a SQL Server environment. You need to be writing all of that in stored procedures, or you need to stand up some Jupyter notebooks that are going to automate all of that scripting. You don't want to be touching that stuff. You really want to reduce those touch points. The computer should be able to do that, so you free up those folks to actually like get after those nittier grittier questions that you were talking about earlier. So that's the plan. I'm sorry, you were raising your hand, and I'm conscious of the time because it's 10 o'clock.
The impact on the reporting up from the local schools, is there anything unique or different about the way they'll need to go about that? Or is that once it gets there, you're coordinating it in a way that the completely non-uniform systems currently being used in our schools or other sources that are reporting into it can continue to be non-uniform? I mean, that isn't an ideal, but it is the reality, I think.
You're right, it is the reality. There's a lot of variation all across the state. I think that the first thing we need to do about this, and I've been starting to engage the folks in the field on this, the data folks in the field, at the supervisory level. The first thing we need to do is talk together, right? Because at the end of the day, this is an economy of like, what, 700,000 people? Like, there's just not that many folks of us out there, like, period. And, like, I'm hiring most of them. So, so A, we need to engage. We need to work with them. We also need to show some leadership in charting a course and helping folks figure out how we can all be rowing together. So there are some engagement plans that my crew is executing on over the next number of months. There's some adjustments to how we provide field support that we're going to be making over the next number of months. And then I'm really looking forward to having larger scale conversations with them based on feedback that we've collected over the last couple of months. And I think that if we can at least start talking, we can make some meaningful steps towards simplifying. Because when we simplify, we can actually help each other a lot more effectively. And my crew is living proof of that. So I think we have to start by talking. I think we need to do, just like we've done this, you know, to the ADS partners, we need to be doing this with our field partners.
But at this point, they will continue to report to you the way they have been, and this system will accommodate that, so there's not budgetary impact locally in changes to their reporting, or
It depends
will
on the
this-
data
will
collection.
they speak to each other?
Okay, I think I understand what you're asking me now. So from a data collection standpoint, we have a couple of major platforms that we're using, right? The EdFusion platform represents the state longitudinal data system. So there's the EdFusion platform, and then there's a whole bunch of other different types of data collections that go on across the organization. So some are deployed as Access applications, others have been, you know, SurveyMonkey in the past. Some have been Cognito forms in the past. We're working with the ADS partners to figure out a better, longer-term tool set, because we too need to reduce the complexity, right? You can't have 15 different ways that 20 different ways that you're collecting data, right? If we reduce the number of ways that we're collecting data and simplify that tends to be a more sustainable approach, both for we who have to manage that infrastructure and for the folks who have to engage in it.
I think the one thought in sort of my local school board or second largest school district in the state, whatever you call us, is that to the extent there'll be changes to unify how the reporting is coming up, if that has a budgetary consideration, while districts are unifying, we're down that path further than others.
Mm-hmm.
But as SUs are becoming unified differently, they may be bringing together different reporting systems within themselves. So if you envision there to be in the near term a particular way you would like data to be reported, to communicate that with the field sooner rather than later, and the support you're able to provide to that, or the grants available for that purpose, or however it might go, I think would be well received, because as districts again are unifying, they are finding similar platforms within themselves, and it's very frustrating to find out that was not the platform the state was going to go with right after the fact, because there's investments made and decisions made
Mm-hmm.
in the local districts. So
Are you talking about SSDDMS?
there were a
The
few
finance
different
system.
points
Yes,
that's
that
right.
our district had made decisions to find out very shortly after that changed.
I
So
see.
not specific to this, but
Okay.
there, it will be, though, specific to this for districts that are unifying when they're looking for a common platform of
Mhm.
looking at their
Mhm.
data together within themselves
Mhm.
and how that gets reported up.
Mhm.
So if there is anticipated changes to that, engaging early and with technical support that can be provided while they are at places for decision-making
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
important.
Absolutely. Totally agreed.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we're at the break time.
We are at the break
Okay,
time.
sorry.
Yeah. Any more questions? Are we? Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
thank
much.
you.
You guys have a great day. You too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take a break. We're 5 minutes past, so we'll return at 20 past.
So we'd like to begin the part of the agenda relating to the Teacher of the Year Awards. Would you like to come forward and give us some orientation?
Absolutely. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Guile, and I'm the current Teacher of the Year Coordinator at the Agency of Education. I've handed out scoring sheets for you to take a look at. As you enjoy the 3 speeches this morning, please take a look at the 4 questions and score on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being the lowest. Yes.
Can you actually take a step even further back and maybe give us a little background?
Absolutely.
On how folks are,
That's right.
The nomination process.
Yeah, that was my next point. So this is the last piece in the process that we use to determine the Vermont Teacher of the Year. This is the selection process that Vermont specifically uses to determine the 2020 Teacher of the Year. Vermont then has an entrant into the National Teacher of the Year program, which is hosted by the CCSSO. These folks have completed an application which is provided by the CCSSO, which has been scored and ranked. They have also participated in an interview with the Vermont Teacher of the Year Committee and have been scored on that as well. And so this is the final piece to that process.
And would you, would you like all three to come to the table at once, or how do you wish to proceed?
That was our plan, and we'll pass the mic. So
That's great.
as you enjoy, we'll have folks come up and complete their speeches one at a time.
Great. Any other questions for Rebecca?
I'm sorry, one is the lowest, four is the highest.
I would like to observe that you teachers might appreciate this. Two of our members are students. Kyle Courtois and Sabina Brochu there. Kyle's a senior, Sabina's a sophomore. So, colleagues, won't it be fun to be grading the teachers for a change? So, whoever would like to, maybe all three of you teachers might come to the chairs, and you can decide which of you will go first. And just please welcome to sit down at the chairs.
So just
Yes, again.
Sorry, just before we start, so we're consistent. The sheet here speaks to a ranking versus a rating, but it sort of implies that this is a rating and not a ranking. So I want to be really clear on that. Okay, so it's a rating, not a ranking. Okay. Okay.
So, welcome. Maybe we could, this is what passes for a State Board of Education in Vermont. And maybe we could just quickly go around and say who you are and where you're from so that our guests know who they're talking to. Kyle, go ahead.
Student member, Georgia.
Kim Gleason, Essex.
Oliver Olson, Londonderry.
Dan French, Secretary.
Jenna O'Farrell, St. Johnsbury.
Sabina?
Sabina Rocher, I'm good to see you.
John O'Keefe, Manchester.
Peter Peltz, Woodbury.
And this is Bill Mathis from Goshen. We'll be here shortly, I'm sure. And I'm John Carroll from Norwich. We welcome you.
Here's Bill.
So,
Just wait 1 second.
oh,
So Bill can hear the
okay.
full.
Right, of course. So, couple things. Be sure to give your name clearly at the beginning so we get the name right on our forms here. And second, some of us are old and we don't hear very well, so feel free to speak with stentorian tones, if you know what I mean by that. So, who wishes to go first? How is this arranged?
The microphone's in front of me, I guess.
Okay.
I take a short straw. So are we waiting for someone? I didn't.
No, you go right ahead.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Kahn. I taught French and Spanish in Maryland, California, and New Hampshire before returning home to Montpelier 6 years ago. I now teach at Main Street Middle School, the middle school I attended 30 years ago. I believe fiercely that all kids can learn and that it is our responsibility as educators to ensure that they do. And while this is a current passion, born out of the achievement gap that this board seeks to address, and my district's work around PLCs and transforming school culture, it has its roots way back, in a time that most of my students would consider the dark ages, in my first teaching assignment. When I was 18, I took a gap year and volunteered as a teacher in Accra, Ghana. My school, the Second Chance Academy, was designed to educate students who couldn't afford the public school fees. In other words, my first exposure to teaching was an attempt to address inequities in the Ghanaian education system. The lessons I learned there have shaped my approach to teaching and would inspire my work should I be bestowed the honor of Teacher of the Year. My first week in Accra, there were 10 students in my class. So part of my job was to go out and recruit new students. My mentor teacher and I would go into homes, visit homes in the poor suburb where we worked. Mothers, aunts, grandparents would invite us into concrete courtyards, and we would sit on overturned laundry buckets and listen to them as they told us why their kids weren't in school. For some families, the boys went to public schools and there was not enough money left over for the girls to do so. In others, the women cooked food to sell and the children were required to hawk meat pies or wache at the bus stop during school hours. After 2 weeks of listening to these families and telling them about our program, our class size swelled to 50 students. The simple yet challenging act of reaching out to students and families, showing them that we valued them and their education was incredibly powerful. In Accra and in Vermont, there can be so many barriers to student achievement. Take Jay, a 7th grade student in my French class whose traumatic background makes him hypervigilant to everything except my instruction. Or a transgender student whose priorities were advocating for his rights or defending himself against bigotry, not memorizing verb conjugations. To reach these students, we need to expand our efforts to educate teachers on trauma-sensitive classroom management and equity literacy. We need to support districts in hiring more school social workers and counselors. And we need to address the geographic and language barriers to publicly funded pre-K. During the limited hours of the Second Chance Academy back in Ghana, there was a brief break. The mentor teachers would go off and chat and eat at a food stall. I instead would spend those times with the mob of 10 to 16-year-olds that made up my class. Over the course of weeks and months, I learned all of their names, Gifty, Moses, Dinah, and who was related to whom. That was complicated. And they taught me words in Ga. And in the classroom, I found that when I used their names or remembered a detail about their life, they sat up and visibly brightened. I believe that our recruiting efforts helped bring them to the classroom, but that the friendships that we built kept them there. Relationships foster engagement. And these days, I work really hard to learn all of the students' names, all 383 of them at my school, so I can greet them in the hallway. I get to know their idiosyncrasies and the interests of my students so I can personalize instruction. And I routinely ask for their opinion and apply their feedback to my lesson plans. Nothing is impossible. The Second Chance Academy was founded by my host mother, Eunice Miranda Brock, with an endowment of roughly $1,500. Reaching all kids will not be easy, but we can do it with all of us working together in our classrooms, in collaborative teams, at board meetings, in the legislature, and in Congress to engage all students and remove barriers. As Teacher of the Year, this would be my mission. Thank you very much. It says not to touch, but I'm going to touch it anyway. You want to go next?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Who would like to go next?
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Emily Therian, and I'm a high school English and social studies teacher at Randolph Union High School. I grew up in northeastern Vermont and have chosen to continue to build my life here in our beautiful state as an adult. I'm fortunate to be able to work in a profession that I love and in one that continually challenges me to learn and improve while offering the invaluable rewards of a sense of purpose and intellectual growth. One of the most formative experiences of my career has been working alongside students in our racial justice project-based learning class. Last year, we organized a statewide conference in which over 200 students came together as racial justice activists to try to understand how to build a better future for themselves. The joy and purpose I witnessed among students who had previously felt alienated and unseen was transformative, and this experience has become a central part of who I am as an educator. While the rewards of teaching are numerous, so too are the challenges. And Vermont teachers, along with teachers across the country, currently face a daunting set of challenges in a country experiencing a sense of cultural and political turmoil. What should we, as teachers, do when faced with the reality of systemic oppression, hatred, and bigotry? What should we do when our students are increasingly exposed to these ideas, either passively or directly? My answer to these questions is that when it comes to moral imperatives, silence or attempted objectivity equate to complicity. Should I be honored as the Vermont Teacher of the Year, my message would be exactly that. If we fail to lead with courage or move with clear moral integrity in order to speak out against the injustices pervasive in our society, we are in effect condoning those injustices. By not addressing how social injustice impacts our children, we are devaluing their lives. As teachers, we have an immense amount of influence and power in the classroom, and we can use this positional power to address current inequities stemming from historical injustices. And we can do this in a number of ways. Teachers need support and training to learn how to do the essential self-work that is at the center of these issues. We must examine our own experiences with inequity and privilege and our own biases that manifest in the classroom. With an increased understanding of where we as individuals fit into this world, we can then examine our curricula, both taught and hidden, to identify potential ways in which what and how we teach can reproduce the inequities in our society. We can use this perspective to foster learning environments that are courageous in their commitment to justice and that cultivate empathy and critical thinking within our students. We can lead courageously by engaging students in meaningful and compassionate dialogues about our world, and in doing so can help them develop essential communication skills desperately needed in an increasingly complex world. Through these actions, we can work to right the injustices of our society by validating and celebrating the individual lives of all of our students, regardless of who they are or where they come from. James Baldwin wrote that a civilization is not destroyed by wicked people. It is not necessary that people be wicked, but only that they be spineless. Our children need us to courageously confront systemic oppression. They need us to act with bold moral integrity. We must use our positional power as educators to speak out against injustice in order to work alongside our students in building a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And now we'll hear from Bethany.
Hello. I think you'll notice a theme as I continue the speeches. So good morning. I'm Bethany Morrissey, a 5th and 6th grade teacher at Salisbury Community School, a small rural school in central Vermont, part of Addison Central School District. And I'm incredibly honored to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I work with amazing teachers that could very well be sitting here right now. So this is my 17th year teaching, my 14th in Vermont. I actually began my life and career in central Massachusetts. My husband wanted to come here, and I agreed and said I would stay for 3 years. We had read somewhere that that was a magic number where you'd feel acclimated to a community and know if it was a good fit. So 14 years later, here I am. See, there's something special about Vermont. Small schools, close communities, the smell driving by a farm at certain times of the year, but also an open-mindedness and drive that I had not previously fathomed existed. To be on the forefront of so many things seems to be the Vermont way. When looking back at historical events, we find examples like being the first state to abolish slavery, the first state to open an institution of higher learning for women, the first state to graduate an African American at an American college, and the first state to grant same-sex couples all the rights and privileges of marriage. These were big deals at the time. These were big wins. And these were ways in which Vermont disrupted injustice. And we've done it before, and we need to do it again. And it seems like we all agree. I believe we in Vermont have the ability to make wide-reaching changes like the ones I mentioned because we have a uniquely small population. We can make changes and see the effects more quickly than others. And although there are many avenues in which you could take this, especially now, many issues with which you could attempt to solve, there's one in my mind, in my teacher's view, that I feel is integral. There's a vast inequity that exists among our students, and it has been widening. I'm sure that my 5th grade teacher saw it too in 1990. However, in 1990, 33% of our students in the United States qualified for free and reduced lunch, and today over 50% do. So there's evidence there. And when I see that research, I do see numbers. When I look into my classroom and I see the disparity, I see their faces. I see their hopes and dreams, and then I sit with their parents who also have hopes and dreams, but worries. And I walk away from those conferences with worries too, because I know the obstacles that they will face. I know how hard the upward climb to economic prosperity is for some of my learners. I'm always wondering what else I can do. I never feel like I've done enough. I think that is a teacher's sense of perpetual shame, but I also think it's our source of motivation. Because see, America's educational system has often been blamed for creating this inequity. And I don't think that that's fair. These accusations, they're just not fair. For the most part, our schools are not to blame. I have the opportunity to travel around the country over the summer from San Diego, Nashville, Portland, and I provide professional development for teachers. And they all care, and they're all doing as much as they can. So we can't be blamed for economic policies in our country that have created this inequity. It's not a new concern. So teachers in schools have not failed us. But that doesn't mean we should sit by idle. And there are 2 areas in which I feel we could advocate. Affordable, high-quality childcare for all families. Families can't afford high-quality childcare, and early educators can't afford to make less. We need to update the figures we use to determine eligibility for programs. Current guidelines are not recent. Let's provide pre-kindergarten opportunities that include transportation. Study after study determines it's an area that reaps benefits left and right. In the long run, it will actually save money. Children who attend will need fewer services throughout their school careers, saving dollars. But more importantly, why we should really care is that study after study shows us that learners attending preschool are less likely to drop out, less likely to commit crimes, less likely to experience teenage pregnancy, and more likely to positively impact our society. It levels the playing field from the get-go. I don't teach at that level, but I definitely see the ramifications of my learners who have had that access and opportunity and those that haven't. Another area in which I also believe we need to provide advocacy and funding for is extended learning opportunities for schools and families. We need to connect our resources, and I believe that districts coming together have done that. I've seen that in my district. We became unified with other schools. So students can't afford to play through Parks and Rec in elementary school, and they can't get there, but schools aren't providing opportunities. So those that can continue those pursuits when they hit middle school and high school, and those that haven't had the experiences don't join. This is an area in which I passionately work. I seek out learning opportunities that can happen, extended and after, find grants, organize a Kids on the Run Club, Pinball Wizards, and visualize and organize our district's first Youth Citizen Summit hosted by Mill McGibbon last year for 150 fifth grade students. We've paved the way before, and we need to do it again. Investing in schools inspires hope and pride that has a measurable effect on the community at large. The benefits of feeling supported are far-reaching and leads to upward economic mobility. The changes I mentioned would once again, like in the past, disrupt cycles of injustice, which Vermont is already known for. That's it.
Thank you very much, Bethany. Well, we thank each of you. You're clearly very accomplished and distinguished teachers and professionals. You're the kind of people that we always want to imagine in front of our children in the classrooms and in the school communities. And we're very grateful to you for your service to our children in our state. and for your ambition in competing for this recognition so that your message can be shared with others and more widely. So we thank you very much for coming. I think you can return to your seats. I should ask, is there a provision for questions or discussion? Not usually. It's probably a good thing because this board would have about an hour's worth of questions for you, agreements and wanting to know more, but I think you're best off if you're excused from that. And we thank you very, very much. Rebecca, is there anything else we should know now?
Well, the Outstanding Teacher Day at UVM is when we will be announcing the 2020 Vermont.
Yeah, tell us the date of that.
October 9th.
What happens, can I ask a question?
Please.
I think it's unfortunate that only one of you can win, but that is unfortunately, so let's do it, certainly, I don't think it should take anything away from what happens, I was gonna say, what happens to the winner? I said, I guess I should, that almost sounds like you're gonna be put in the stocks. What does the winner do after they win?
They move on to the National Teacher of the Year program, and each state is allowed to enter one person for the year. So the National Teacher of the Year would be someone from that pool. And there's a cohort of teachers there from all across the U.S. that will be meeting and having professional development.
Well, I would say we wish you all well. So, board members, we have about 5 minutes until our next topic. Yeah, that's correct. So let's each of you take a moment and do your scoring. And I believe Rebecca will gather your ballots when you're ready. So let's hear from the secretary.
Just briefly, I know we'll be spending more time together in the next 12 hours or so. But I appreciate your interest in the data presentation. I think, as I mentioned, my logic on that was to at least start a conversation or prepare you to engage around the issue of how we define quality, how we measure quality. This topic sort of gets onto is related, not directly related to that, but it's one of important considerations in the agency is around capacity, and capacity isn't just about staffing our positions, though that's certainly a centralized strategy or an important strategy. It's also about getting coherence, and I would argue also simplicity about the work. So I would just comment on that to say, firstly, Vermont's data reporting requirements are the same as every other state. It's not dependent on the number of pupils we have. Vermont has to do the same compliance reporting as California has to do. But on the other end, on the front end of it, we only have 75,000 students, and California has millions. So we have to sort of make sure that our infrastructure is able to respond to the demands of the compliance reporting, but also help inform our policy and decision-making in a very rural, small state from a student population perspective. And that's just to alert you that we're kind of heading down that path. And what starts to happen is as we get more clarity about what the function of that back-end operation starts to look like and why it needs to look like it does, and I would argue it is about modernization to a certain extent. It also helps drive decisions on the front end that previously were not really being made as a consideration of the broader demands on our infrastructure. So I'll be talking about, in this larger issue of quality, talking about the report card, for instance, as a project that was stood up, in my view, without real broad consideration of the demands on the infrastructure, how we would use that information, how much it would cost, how big of it and how complex of a project it should be relative to the size of our state. So, yes.
In time past, these very small school districts were sort of an anomaly in terms of federal
Accountability?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would assume the mergers might help on that front?
Yeah, and I think the other aspect in Act 46, we're shifting the LEA for accountability is now the school district, not the individual school.
Right.
Though we still have to monitor individual school aspects of that accountability, but it was intentional on our part in Vermont to shift that to a larger organization so that the issues of small n or organizational improvement could be
Right.
dealt with more systemically as opposed to at school-by-school basis.
Right.
Dr. Secretary. It was gonna say Mr.
Secretary's
Sec-
fine,
Mr.
Mr. O'Keefe.
Secretary, Dr. Secretary. As far as data suppression, I just had a quick question. As far as data suppression, I would assume that there's some states where the topic probably doesn't even come up, like New York, our neighbor to the west. Any idea how, as far as, because all this data is federally required, are there states, how do we compare? Do we have one of the most suppressed states in the country? As
Oh.
far as pupil counts and schools that we can't report on because there's so few pupils?
Yeah, I don't know how we'd make that comparison. It's a great question. Part of it, I think, would come to the definition of what the LEA is. You know, what is the entity for accountability? You know, to Peter's earlier question.
Oh, yeah.
If we moved accountability to a larger entity, you know, part of our issue from an apples to apples standpoint on that question would be how many micro entities do we have, you know, for accountability reporting purposes?
Yeah, where sample sizes would be too small anyways. You have 3
Right.
students. The sample population is so small
Yeah.
that the aggregated data wouldn't be useful anyways.
Yeah, and it does, to get to my sort of, just sort of setting the stage for this future conversation about how we report in terms of how the report card is structured. We can build a very complex data structures and visualizations of data, but we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is that even worth it? If we have very small structures where we can see what's going on without a more formal approach, you know, so we
Yeah.
have to right size, I think, in particular, our visualization of the data.
Yeah.
The problem becomes, the school is really the unit of instruction. And when you start aggregating across a bigger group, what you do is increase the imprecision of your measure.
Sure.
Because you would, if you had a very big, poor school with a bunch of more affluent ones, then you would have a distorted picture if you went to the supervisory union. And the state law says that we're supposed to do this at the school level. And I don't think we've ever done that.
Yeah, I mean, we have, and we'll get into the issue of the statutory framework. The law also says the SU is the structure for accountability. So we have conflicting areas in the statute. That was a modification made under Act 46, actually.
Okay, that helps a lot.
Yeah, but to your point, I think
you're
the issue
convinced.
is, you know, what are we trying to do with the data? We have this issue of public assurance. When we start talking about another use of the data is actual school improvement, which is school-based, not school district improvement. Part of what we've been working on as an agency is to think about, well, what is our theory of action on improving schools, the individual schools, no matter what size they are. It increasingly, particularly in a post-Act 46 landscape, we talk a lot about putting that responsibility on the larger school system. So we've under Act 46, we've put a single board now over multiple schools, where in many cases, one board correlated to a single school. So if we have a board that now operates 4 elementary schools, instead of previously where a board operated a single elementary school, the theory of action would be that that board would now be confronted with the equity issues among their 4 elementary schools. And that's an important consideration when we think about the use of data to improve schools, not just to think about using the data to provide assurance to the broader public. So we'll unpack all these issues going forward, but to Bill's previous comment, I think what's emerging now is basically a plan anyway. I mean, your critique, I think, was right on. This is just a plan. Where's the substance? But we're heading down a path where the substance is going to be produced. But previously, we didn't have a plan, you know, and we're starting to make some decisions around putting resources together into a single division. So patterns of organizational work can appear. It allows us to make better decisions about charting the future course and direction of the agency.
Is that data gathering, or is that also in terms of guidance and actually personalized attention to schools that needs, additional help?
Well, I think it all feeds into sort of internal work of the agency that I would argue this board previously, before Act 98, which is our conversation, I think, largely later today, would have been more deeply involved in what are the operational aspects of the agency. what I'm trying to do is sort of walk both ends of this, to show you kind of what we're doing, even though you don't have a direct oversight role of that. But hopefully it will help inform what your conversation later on in terms of what you think your role should be relative to this work. So it's important that we collaborate, but you don't direct that work as in a way you used to. So I sort of sidestep your question a little bit, but just say, I think hopefully you found this useful to your future deliberations on your role. It also helps you understand what the trajectory of our work is as well.
I think about the description, Dan, of the smaller schools looking at the equity across the full district now, and the power of doing that, and the value of data in doing that. And so I would say, to the extent there is also best practice to move towards equity, I think support to the field or guidance to the VSBA and really focusing, and the regional meetings are going to include the regional meetings, I believe, or the annual meeting, a deeper look at the dashboard and the report card, because having boards know it's out there and not know how to really use the data to impact equity across the broader system would be a lost opportunity. So to the extent there's guidance around that or technical support, I know, as we know on everything across the state, there are varying capacities within districts, even unified districts. And there's a lot on the plates of those that are unifying. It would be really unfortunate for kids if this wealth of data gets buried in the other operational things that they're trying to do to unify. So wherever there's support
Yeah, it's a good point.
in that is welcomed.
Yeah, so that's a conversation we'll follow along later today, I'm sure. The other point under my report I wanted to raise with you is that the agency is moving. That's actually coming to fruition. So about 2/3 of the agency will move to its new location over the weekend of October 4th. We'll arrive at our new destination, National Life, on Monday morning, October 7th. And then the remaining portion of the agency will move later in the beginning part of November. So just want to put that on your radar that we're moving. And maybe at some point we can give you a tour of our new space. if you'd be
Easier
interested.
parking.
I was going to say.
We'd probably figure out how to get you up there and find a
National
place
Life?
for you to park, yeah.
It's crowded.
If you're interested in that kind of.
Find a parking
Yeah,
place.
yeah, you can, yeah.
You don't have to pay for it either.
Mr.
Yeah,
Secretary.
good point.
Any other comments or questions from the board?
I raised this issue with my colleague from Berry City as well, but I won't miss the parking tickets in Berry that I've had to pay in the past, so I just want to make that point.
Sir?
Could you tell us a little bit about what's
I think I paid two of them.
happening with what I think is Act 11, the bargaining bill? It seems like that could have tremendous implications.
You're talking about the bargaining of teachers' health insurance at the
Yes.
state level? I don't have a direct role in that process. Under that statute, my understanding is that it's largely the school boards on one side of the bargaining table and the teachers' association on the other side of the table. So I have no other insight into that process other than I understand they're at impasse in the process. I'm not sure where that will go. I did send out to you, as I, just consistent with my early pattern, if there are communications that you might find interesting, I'm having them distributed to the board. I did send to you the announcement from VHI of what their proposed rate increase will be. Like Bill, as a previous superintendent, when I see those numbers, it sort of colors my thinking for a number of weeks. And I must admit, I'm still kind of depressed by that. They're proposing over a 12% increase in their health insurance rates, which really is, when you're in this part of your the year as a superintendent, making sort of beginning assumptions on your budgetary cycle. That's really, it's a hard place to start. As you know, most school budgets are aiming for a nominal increase, and to start out the gate with an over a 12% increase in health insurance costs when 80% of your costs are attributed to personnel is a hard way to start the process.
We
So-
usually try to do 6 or 7 in the second part of the year. When you try to keep, if you're a local official and you're trying to keep your budget at about 3%,
Yeah.
2.5%, 3%, having a number like that the second part of the year is just,
It's the second year in a row,
yeah.
so.
So what did you originally budget for?
I didn't budget, in my role as secretary, it's not about our
I know,
budgets.
but, I mean, but you do
Locally?
have to, you have to present kind of early in the.
When I was a superintendent, I would bake this assumption into my modeling, because I want to have the, in the beginning, when you're building a budget, you want to have the worst-case scenario sort of presented or built into your assumptions. And then as you go forward, you can boards, feed that into my board's deliberations. They could say, well, let's guess 8% instead of 12, because it looks better. But you could, set yourself up for a problem on the other end. So, but I prefer to start with that assumption, whatever. The nice thing is VHI gives us that number earlier now, from a superintendent's perspective. It's nice to have that now, as opposed to later.
I mean, I find myself getting excited about a 5 or 6 or 7% increase in healthcare. That's like something to really get excited about and cheer for. And if it was in any other, if it was an electric bill, I mean, imagine if Green Mountain Power increased the rate by 7 or 8%, let alone 12%. It's just interesting how we've assumed or just come to the point of acceptance that healthcare will go up double digits as a percentage.
I think we need to end this discussion. We have our next visitors came all the way up from the far southern corner of the state. We don't want to keep them waiting. So I'd like to invite to the table Mark Anderson, who's chair of the board of Inspire School, Mr. Ray Stevens, who's the executive director, and Michael Bandler, who's, I don't know what your proper title is, Mr. Bandler?
Accountant.
CFO. Thank you for visiting with us.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to just begin this discussion. We have 45 minutes. We've kind of been here before in some ways. I want to just read to you, the board, just to set context, something that was forwarded to these three folks by council. Let's just be clear that this is all because, I think 2 meetings ago, at least, the board made a finding that based on what information it had at that time, limited amount of information, that it was concerned that possibly the Inspire School might not have the, quote, financial capacity to meet its stated objectives. That's the term of art in statute. And it is a condition of continuing the operation of a school. And so there was some reason to think that the school had slipped into a condition where it did not have the financial capacity. The board understands, and I think this is important for all to understand, that the financial capacity goes far beyond balance sheets or cash on hand. Those may be indicators, but they're not usually the root cause of problems. And our experience has been that it often, an erosion of financial capacity or an incident is often a result of failures in governance or weaknesses in governance, financial oversight, and even leadership. Basically, the situation you and we are in is that until you convince this board that you fully understand how and why the triggering incidents happened, and more importantly, have put in place robust mechanisms, institutional mechanisms to correct them, as well as financial mechanisms, then the board will be hard put to find otherwise than it has so far. And your goal, of course, is to convince us that indeed you have restored, if it was ever missing, you have restored the school's financial capacity for the foreseeable future because of financial and institutional corrections that you have put in place. And when the board is satisfied on that point, which we would be very happy to be satisfied, then the board will essentially retreat from its earlier concern and say that it is satisfied with the financial capacity of the school, and you're out from underneath this kind of cloud that your situation has placed you in. So that's what we have to do, that's what they have to do, just so we all understand. How would you like to proceed?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to begin with a statement.
Please.
And I understand it's the board's desire to speak with Dr. Stevens, so I'll try and make it short to allow for time for that.
Sure, thank you.
Again, my name's Mark Anderson. I'm the chair of the board of directors for Inspire School for Autism. I apologize, I'm from the technical generation, and my notes are actually primarily on my phone. So I'm not texting while I discuss this with you, but I work digitally. So first off, I'd like to continue to renew our appreciation for the board's inquiry. This has been a difficult time for us as a board of directors, for the school, for the employees as well as the children. Our passion is to provide excellent education to children with autism, and we've done that for about 10 years. This gets in the way, and that's a problem. We fully understood that, and over the last 12 or so months, the opportunity to investigate why has been of utmost priority. It's the belief of the board of directors that the Inspire School for Autism is a victim of a crime. I'm a police officer by trade, so this is my bailiwick. And while education is not of my primary occupation, I've worked as a school resource officer. I've worked with this school for a couple of years. And even before I was formally involved with it, we were working with the Inspire School to understand from a law enforcement capacity how to work with children and adults with autism. We are all passionate people about delivering education and allowing children with autism to succeed later on in life, and as far as gaining employment where they were otherwise believed not to get that. The board of directors requested an investigation from the police earlier this year based on our review of financial documents, the lack of financial documents, and what we later learned under the advice of a certified public accountant who sits to my right was fraudulent financial statements. There was a statement made by a president many years ago, trust but verify. As a board, we failed because we trusted but did not verify. It has been clear to us that there's things that have needed to have been done that we thought were being done because we trusted our executive director to accomplish them for us. There becomes a point from a board perspective where you have to evaluate what your involvement is versus how extending too far becomes micromanaging an executive director. And unfortunately, our pendulum swung a little too loose. It was just this week that the police, a detective from the police department, reached out to us to ask for some of the initial documents of their investigation. From my personal experience as an investigator of financial crimes, these are long, slow investigations. We are still waiting for answers because some of them will require police involvement. Unfortunately, we don't get to escape that black cloud from the sense of a criminal investigation because this is going to continue for a while, and we know that. But it is still our belief that a crime occurred and that that's part of or one of the triggering events that occurred that allowed this to happen. Through many of the lessons learned over the last year, we have reorganized our board. I am a new chair to the board. Part of the reason for my selection was because of where I live. I live in the town of Brattleboro, the same place as the school. Our prior chair had, because of life circumstances, moved out to eastern Massachusetts to be closer to their family, one of whom is a child with autism. They were involved before they moved at a significant level. And when they moved, that level diminished. The board's treasurer, also the board chair's husband, and he was here last meeting, he also moved. And so again, a reduction, degradation of our board in an oversight capacity where most of the oversight was conducted by email. When you receive a financial statement via email that supports what you're being told, it makes sense. when you're told by someone who's an expert, licensed, trained accountant that these are wrong, just made up, obviously there's concern. So I took over as the board chair about the beginning of July, and even through our conversations over the last 2 meetings, we are still working on what our next steps are. I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think we've done a really good job of reestablishing the financial aspects of the organization to ensure that we are able to operate. The board also chose to select a new treasurer who lives one town south of Brattleboro, 2 towns south of Brattleboro. So he's also living significantly closer. He is also, he operates his own business. He's been doing that for many years. He has understanding of financial operations in a small business. He is also now more directly involved in the internal controls to prevent fraudulent or criminal spending of money.
Is this Mr. Craig White?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Over the past, since our last conversation, at the advice of Mr. Bandler, our CFO, we, as a board, reviewed his recommendation of adopting an audit committee. The purpose of the audit committee is an independent committee, an organization, so to speak, that is responsible for the oversight and as an entity within the organization for whistleblowers. These are things that people knew about, and the board did not receive the communication. We don't know that answer. We're still looking. But unfortunately, people knew that something was awry, and we did not get the message. That was concerning. So part of our audit committee is not only to establish people with professional expertise in finance, as well as law if we can, but also to serve as a formal organization that's not under the direct control of the board of directors, to ensure that there is a fair, impartial, and independent review of the financial capacity of the school. The board started developing policies, of which we submitted 5 to you. These are still draft policies. They are currently under review of legal counsel. We are looking to ensure that not only do board members receive proper education on what their responsibilities as a board member are, but also that we ensure that as things change, we continue to educate. And we are also in the process of accessing consultants at the advice of our legal counsel on providing board orientation and education for what our responsibilities as board members are. We've disseminated, and I believe, I forget if I mentioned this in the last meeting, but we disseminated the Attorney General's guidance on the responsibilities of a board member for a nonprofit organization. We've also begun a search for appropriate consultant, one of which is in the Brattleboro area, who has over 20 years' experience working with educating board of directors on their responsibilities, as well as renewing information as it changes in the legislature. We've also, though it's not, I think, remote or necessary to what happened, we did begin working on adopting a conflict of interest policy, because while we don't believe that that itself, a conflict of interest issue arose with the issues at hand, it seemed to be prudent, so we submitted that as well. And then there's 3 financial policies which have been supplied. And those are more directly dealing with internal controls and ensuring appropriate action is conducted by all officers and the administration of the school. In conclusion, it's with gratitude that the Board of Directors receives the questions of the Board of Education. It's challenged us to seek answers. Sometimes it's easy to say, here's the problem, but when you have another perspective, it's a light and a lens that you can look at a problem with that might not be our own. Thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any for me.
I'd like to make time first to have Mr. Stevens speak with us. Dr. Stevens?
Yes.
Welcome here. We're happy to hear from you.
Well, what do you want me to address specifically? I have a long history of working with schools, residential schools, special schools. I grew up in South Dakota, in a Norwegian Lutheran home, and ended up in Washington DC getting a master's degree. Arrived in Vermont in 1969 at the Austin School for the Deaf as a teacher. Next year became principal. Was principal for 4 years. Went back to school, PhD from Syracuse. Back to Austin in '77. And I was again principal for 10 years and then 4 years as headmaster.
Mr. Stevens, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
I think you asked what question to address. One of the questions that comes to mind is the role of the executive director in having fiduciary responsibility for everything that happens at the school. It's our impression that the previous executive director may not have been particularly engaged in overseeing the work of the financial work done by others. So what are your thoughts and experience doing so?
Well, I've been executive director, I guess, 4 times of programs and institutions. And clearly, the finance person is the one that you depend on. I think having Michael Bandler as an independent CPA on board is a person who first wants to protect his own license. So I think you can rest assured that when he says we have the money, we don't have the money, we might have the money, he's doing that from his own self-preservation. Certainly he's working for the school. But as a CEO, I would not order a major expense without checking with the finance officer. I would want to know all the time where we stand. Frankly, numbers and budgets and balances interest me, but not the nitty-gritty part of the finance operation. My interest is in providing support to staff and making a relationship with students, one that I can know them as people and can know if they are enjoying and learning from the school. The role itself as an overseer of finances, I certainly review the reports that he gives. I know the income of the school. I know how many students we have. Without student enrollment, we have no financial stability, obviously. We've gone from 16 kids to 20 kids since the school opened this fall. And one thing to be noted about those students, they were all under the age of 10. When I first was associated with the school 4 years ago, many of the students were over the age of 16. And it looked like kids were going to age out of special ed or be able to go back to their local school. And that presented a real enrollment challenge. Now with enrollment of kids tending to be younger, I think people are more willing to say they need a special program and get them into special programming earlier. So here, these 4 kids that entered this fall, all under 10 years of age, will they be there until they age out of special ed? 2 of them, I definitely think will not be. 2, I think, will be. Anyway, that's how I see my financial role.
Thank you. We'll now open up for questions from the board. Oliver.
So question for you, Mr. Anderson. One thing you said piqued my curiosity, and I want to make sure I heard you correctly. The prior chair and treasurer, those 2 officers were related? Yes. That to me is a concerning practice in general with any board, and I guess my question is that something that you've identified as an issue and that you're looking to take action on? Not obviously you've taken action now, presumably, but going forward as part of your formal board processes and procedures.
So I believe we already have resolved that issue in that both are no longer in capacities to have a concern of that nature.
And it wasn't directed at those and specific individuals. It was more the construct of having officers and the chair and the treasurer principally who are related to one another. Are you looking to take steps to ensure that that never happens again?
So I don't believe that the board has addressed it as specifically as that. Do
you see that as a bad practice?
Yes.
Okay.
And just to shed some light on how that happened, they're the founders of the school.
Yeah.
So they, I don't want to speak on their behalf regarding their circumstance, but they had a child with autism and they felt they weren't getting education appropriate to it. And so they said, let's create a program. They've been involved from the beginning, but I also think that over 10 years of membership to a board of directors is a long time. And people do get tired and they want to move on themselves. We have looked at expanding our board, which will also diminish the possibility of a conflict, but it's also why we did bring in the conflict of interest policy to address things of that nature.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? John?
The CFO, who does the CFO report to?
The treasurer.
Treasurer, okay. Not the executive director.
That's correct. We've set up somewhat of a divide between the financial operations and the day-to-day operations of the school and the education of the students. One of the issues, if I may say so, is that we had people wearing multiple hats, some of who are not financial professional, auditing professionals, law enforcement, legal professionals, in roles that require some of that expertise. The school has gone out of its way now to start acknowledging that there was deficiency in the basic core people, to bring in other people who are professionals in this area, and we've separated the functions.
So, not to get into the minutia, but, so a bill comes in, a heating oil bill or whatever, who authorizes that? And how does that go through the system? Is it the executive director that authorizes that bill to be paid?
It depends on the nature of the bill, but the basic flow of things is I'm the one who is the original recipient. If it seems to be ordinary and something that I'm aware of, I will prepare a check for signature by the executive director or by the treasurer with appropriate documentation so they can just look at it and go, yeah, I see what the bill is and why we're paying them the money, or we have a check request form. If it's something that doesn't have a bill that supports it, it's signed at that level by one of the two of them, or both of them, depending on the circumstances.
Do you have a threshold for double signatures?
In theory, all disbursements are double signed.
Okay.
In theory, how about in practice?
Less than all.
What's the threshold?
Certainly something that's irregular and significant, and by significant I mean, let's say, more than $1,000, that would certainly be reviewed by two people, in addition to myself, because I would never process the check unless I was satisfied that on its face it looked appropriate.
Some disconnect between theory and practice concerns us. You have just shared with us rules, financial procedures, and others.
Yes,
Are you living by these procedures
absolutely.
scrupulously?
Beyond.
So maybe you need to have this procedure make it very clear what that threshold is.
Yes.
Other questions? I'd like to pose a question and an observation. And I should say, I do admire the individuals of your board. You who are here, Mr. Anderson, and the Vranos people have been very, very generous in their commitment to this school. I think very loyal to it, have given a lot to it. So there's a lot to be grateful for. It still feels to me as a layperson without expertise in this area that this is still a very, very thin board. It's 5 members, of whom 2 are married. It does not bring a great deal of diversity. Vigorous boards, and we've thought about this a little bit because this was a similar weakness at the Compass School just up the river from you folks. It was a school board which also lost talent and didn't quite realize that they had been just eviscerated. And like yours, time and talent disappeared, and bad things started to happen. So this would just be a thought that you have a lot more work to do to strengthen your board of directors. It certainly involves getting very, very clear articles of behavior, rules of procedure, but it also involves bringing in people who have nothing to do with the school, who aren't in love with what the school does, who doesn't think you folks walk on water. You need skeptics on your board. You need people who come from other backgrounds, and the more you can have, the better. Further to the board and your chairmanship, Mr. Anderson, I would imagine there are occasions given the nature of the students and their ages, that there are occasional incidents of physical acting out or restraint, so forth. It seems to be kind of normal. There may be occasions that either do or should come to the attention of law enforcement. As to conflict of interest, the law and most of our understandings about conflict of interest is of course to be alert to the substance of conflict of interest, but almost equally important, especially for this board, a public body, is the appearance of conflict of interest. Which is defined as if a reasonable person might reasonably think that there is a conflict of interest, that constitutes the appearance. This is a question that you don't have to answer, but you might give some thought to. Since you are fairly visible in the law enforcement community in Brattleboro and the county, you might want to think about whether your leadership of the board puts you in a bind sometimes, where the school has a law enforcement issue that could be awkward for the school. You have a lot of influence, I presume, among your colleagues in the law enforcement community. And so it would seem that you'll need to be particularly attentive. And I'm sure you can do this, but it'll require sort of scrupulous attention on your part to put in place mechanisms so that no one could wonder if the school suppressed information that law enforcement would otherwise want it to address. I don't mean that as a lecture. It's a friendly reminder, and I can tell from the way you're responding that you've thought of this.
Very, very much in depth.
Yeah. Well, it's a good one to be concerned about.
And if I may, for me, my role as a law enforcement officer extends past 9 to 5. And there's a difficult responsibility, as you've outlined as the chair, in defining the confidentiality rights of an employment conversation versus a law enforcement conversation. Right. I champion the law enforcement side 100% hands down. And so I'm also a person who believes that we need to follow the law and do the right thing. Not to say that the members of the board also don't agree, but I've been very clear in my commitment and my role as a law enforcement officer to uphold the law. And if I become aware of wrongdoing, I'm going to pursue it. I'm also held accountable by Vermont law for failing to make reports, specifically as a police officer. If I fail to make a report, I'm held at a higher standard than any other member of the board. While the mandated reporting statute does cover all of us, there's also specific restraints towards police officers. So just for my own self-preservation, I care very much about that issue. It's also one of the reasons I would like to increase the size of our board. We've identified difficulty in doing that, and I actually reached out to a consulting firm that the sheriff's office had worked with previously regarding how do we engage more members for our board. We've been struggling with personal cold calling, I'll say, and that's been difficult. We talk to someone and they say, well, I'm busy right now, but ask me in 6 months. It's almost a joke to us now because everybody's going to be available 6 months from now. So we've struggled with that, and now we've begun engaging people that are experts in the field of nonprofits to increase our size. The Vranoses have also identified this as a concern. I believe Dr. Vranos in the last meeting said he's asked everybody in the hospital to be on the board, and well, 6 months later.
Right.
So those are both things that have been things that we've identified and have been working towards, and I apologize if we have not relayed it earlier.
Great, thank you. Peter, you had a comment or question?
Just a general observation, when these situations come before us, and this isn't the first time, you wonder about, I wonder about, there's a fair amount of approved independents that deal with special needs children. And there's a lot of money involved in the extraordinary needs of these children. And I'm wondering if there's something endemic or that's happening that is a little loose and fast in terms of, I'm not disparaging, I'm just wondering in terms of how, when these kids are of special needs and they need to go someplace, you got to find a place, and obviously in-state is easier and probably less costly and whatnot. But I don't know with 173 and whatnot, whether this is with a different funding approach, how this may be addressed, or, when it's not based on student needs, but based on a consensus model, whether this will come whether this whole process or these institutions will become under closer scrutiny. It's a general question.
Yes, Alderman.
Yeah, and I'll let Secretary French keep me honest here, but I think it's just, I want to respond to that particular question, and then get back to the board governance
Right.
issue. The 173, I don't see that as having a significant impact on these specialized schools, because they tend to serve students who are in excess of the threshold amount.
I understand.
And 173, the scope of 173 is really limited to the population below that threshold amount.
Or in-house, yeah.
Right, right, exactly. So I don't see that as 173 having a particularly significant issue on most of these schools. But keep me honest if you think I'm wrong on that point. But
173 touches all aspects.
yeah.
And we've already identified a need to get into not only the rules around rate setting for specialized schools, but also the broader Rule 2200 series. So we're getting into all those areas. But there is some modifications to the thresholds around the extraordinary costs that are also embedded in 173. But I think your characterization is fair.
Yeah, okay.
You want to comment on governance?
Yeah, so just back to board governance and just to, set expectations, because, for those of us who have served on nonprofit boards in the state, there's varying levels of ability to recruit members, and there are certainly organizations out there that people that are seen as somewhat prestigious, et cetera, for a variety of reasons, and it's relatively easy to recruit board members. You typically have people sort of knocking on your door and looking for an opportunity to serve. But we need to be cognizant of the challenges of some of these schools. Not to be too blunt about it, but for many people, they're not particularly attractive boards to serve on, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I understand your predicament. My suggestion is I think that, there's an opportunity to look within the broader independent school community that you live within, and start a larger dialogue about the rotation of members, because this is another issue within all nonprofits. I think in Vermont we have challenges around turnover and more specifically lack thereof of board members. Good board practice says you really should be turning over members to ensure that, the institution is about the institution and not its board members. So, you might find a useful conversation with your peers, and it might provide an opportunity to have greater rotation of board members going from school to school, bringing that diversity and also enlarging the size of your board.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. I want to try to get this back to some focus for the board. This is not intended to be just another conversation. If possible, it should be the foundation for a decision by the board. I think we have a choice between three possibilities. We continue this dialogue and inquiry to yet another month, or we conclude that the school does not have the financial capacity and shows little prospect of demonstrating it, and therefore the board could act to create a review team to visit the school. Or we conclude that the school does in fact have the financial capacity and has reasonably good prospects of sustaining that. And so I want you now, in what time we have left, which is about at most 10 minutes, to be thinking about what sort of motion you might want to make about this. Before you do that, I don't know how many of you took the time to go through the numbers presented to us. Frankly, they were not easy to follow as the headers were missing and so on, but here's the basics of the numbers that I understand. And I'd like you to be telling me if I've misunderstood anything in any significant degree. You estimate fiscal 2020 revenues to be 1.7 million, which, by the way, is a good bit more than they've ever had, partly because their enrollment is larger. You estimate operating expenditures, just the day in, day out, salary, insurance, all the stuff, at about 1.459, call it 1.5 million. So that leaves you a margin of around $250,000 not consumed by operations. Sort of, it's a net operating profit. So far, is that about right?
Roughly, I
Yeah.
might not have used the words that you used, but I understand your words.
Yeah, it's a net from revenue and sort of routine operations.
Yes,
Retained earnings, is that a better
Yeah.
way to look at it?
excess of income over expenses,
Okay.
whatever.
There we go,
Okay,
yep.
right. Removes all judgment, all values. However, you have a debt of $150,000 left over from 2019, right?
We carried forward, if we're talking about what exists as we sit here now, not at all.
Oh, but as of the 30th of June.
That was correct.
What we're interested in is 2019 is done, you were saddled with about $150,000 hole, if we understand correctly. You have negotiated payback agreements, some of which are 1 year, some are 2, some apparently might even be longer. And so you put yourself on a schedule for paying down this $150,000 arrearage. Is that fair to say?
We were very cautious in our presentation. You're correct. What we have presented is a pay down. I think the reality is a payoff.
All right? What you presented was a pay down.
Yes, sir.
And as I understand your numbers, I took the $25,000 in and out from the furnace as merely just a cash flow adjustment.
It's been paid back. It's as
Yeah,
if it
I'm
never
sure.
happened.
So that doesn't really count in the 151 as of 30 June,
Yes.
okay? As I understand your schedule to pay debt as you presented it in 2020 from sort of the excess of income over expenses, which you remember is about $250,000, is that you have a schedule of about $106,000 of payouts in 2020.
You're
Oh.
close.
Hmm?
Yes, you're close.
Okay. All I wanna do
I know
is be
you're building
close.
up to something, so yes, that's reasonable.
So that leaves you net after operations and net after payouts for 2019 about 140,000 or so, kind of, quote, cash on hand on the 30th of, leaving out depreciation.
Excess cash flow, yes, sir.
Yeah, on hand at the end of the fiscal year 2020. Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, and then there's, with those numbers, there'll be more to pay in 2021. You may be accelerating your schedule.
We're doing it gradually,
yeah,
yes, it could
but-
be, it will be probably accelerated. I agree
We're
with what you just
working from the
said.
data you furnished us, which is the only data we have, it looks like around $45,000 would need to be paid out in 2021 if you stay on the schedule you published with us.
Yes.
So the question is this, and this is a question for the board. There are two kinds of financial capacity. There's sort of quantitative and qualitative. There's money, do you have it or not? And then there's, do you have the ability to manage that effectively? That's what we mean by governance and leadership and oversight. I think you all have to reach your conclusions about how well this school is moving its governance and oversight. The other part I'm trying to get at by running through these numbers for you is, should the board be satisfied that this school will generate enough financial reserves to expeditiously discharge its debt from 2019? If it cannot do so, it will find itself in deeper trouble later on with its creditors. It has a plan to do so. The question is that plan credible to you? And I think the question for you to tell us is, if you're left at the end of 2020 with a net of all operating and debt service expenses of about $140,000, and maybe less if you're more aggressive, will that be sufficient for you to going into the then coming 2021 fiscal year?
Let me first say, as we sit here and speak, we have over $100,000 in the bank.
It's
Cash.
immaterial.
I'm just trying to somewhat of a validation of what we did. These were numbers that are a projection on a piece of paper. We have had discussions, I'm not a board member, but I participate in meetings as to what we should do and how quickly we should pay down the debt and how cautious we should be in case there's some kind of unforeseen event or need in the future that we're sitting there. It's the reason, I mean, the question that would come to my mind if I was sitting in your chair is why aren't you just finishing off the debt and be done with it and come out into the next year clean at zero? We're trying to build up a reserve so that we don't work on a hand-to-mouth type of situation. We want to have some money on hand that if one of our clients, one of the districts doesn't pay us, that there is enough money that we don't have to fret about the payroll and what's going to happen on next Tuesday. So we're trying to build up a reserve to some extent also to lead to a more normal operation, if that's the way to put it.
You should always have cash going forward.
Yes.
Right. And the question is cash that amounts to about 5%, 6 or 7% of your gross revenues available at the end of this fiscal year sufficient? Because were you not paying off this debt, you'd have $250,000 in cash, right?
We'd have quite a bit of money, yes. Some of it had to be paid, but sure, if we paid none of it, if that was a possibility.
So, Peter.
What intrigues me is that it's all based on student count. And
Yes,
that-
it is.
And that is very, uncertain.
Yes.
It's not like you've got a market share and that you can control it or whatever. This is, that's what I don't.
Let me, sorry, bingo, I would say bingo, you're right, the profitability, and I know that's not a nonprofit term, but if we were permitted to use that word, or the excess of income over expense, or positive cash flow, is very much determined. At 15 or 16, you're at break even. At 20, it's very rich. Below 16, it's very bad. Just based on our numbers, even if we cut staff and do everything appropriate as that number would change.
We've had, excuse me, just independent colleges closed just because of student count. I mean, this is not, this is the current reality.
Exactly right.
Let me do this. When we have a count of 20, we have signed contracts for this school year. This is not that they, in theory, and I don't know about the exception, Ray could probably speak to it better than I can. These are signed contracts with commitments to bring 20 students to our school through next year.
Are these all public pay?
Yes. With very, very small exceptions. A few parents of prior students wanted to come during the summer, so they became direct pays.
So just a suggestion to move us forward here. I want to recognize everything that you guys have done to right the ship, and I think you have evidence very clearly that you're on a really good trajectory, certainly a much better one than you were on before. But there's still a lot of work ahead of you. So I come back to Mr. Anderson, your the old saying, trust but verify. I think on one hand, I want to recognize the efforts you've made. On the other hand, I do think we need to verify, but I think it would be premature to have a team go in and evaluate now. I would actually prefer to establish a team that could go in, say, in 6 months, and then really give you the opportunity to operationalize everything that you've been talking about and you've already started to, but really give you enough a runway to get off the ground, and then with the hope that we would send in a review team really just to verify that, that yes, you have put everything into place and it becomes a formality at that point.
Mm-hmm. Kim?
Not having been on the review team, to what extent is that time, and if it were to end up being more of a formality, Oliver, is there another method of satisfying that maybe 6-month outlook that is less labor intensive than convening a team, common date, and actually being on site? And as much as anything, thinking about our whatever precedent we set in doing this, we want the standard to be such that we are going in because we have continuing concerns, or at least that's my understanding of the role in this, because otherwise we could end up with more of these than we know what to do with, and that would either exceed our capacity, but also perhaps put undue burden on the organizations. We have oversight responsibility, but I just want us to be cautious.
Is it possible to table this item and approve the renewal for a shorter period of time?
Oh, yeah, that might be.
It's
That
essentially
might
what-
accomplish the same thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So table the item of,
They're not up for renewal.
No, I think it was the other.
oh, yeah, you're right,
School.
you're right. What's this
And I
license
guess-
through?
Pardon?
What's this license through? What's the date on this license?
It's an approval.
It's a
I
financial
know,
capacity.
I know.
Yeah,
I just
but
wonder
we
if-
could, what's the approval status? When is
Yeah.
that? Do we know when?
Do you happen to know in the back?
Okay.
All
Okay.
right.
Ah.
All right,
maybe-
let me see then how you would feel about requiring the school to come back to us in 6 to 8 months with an update on, they'll be 2/3 of the way through the school year. You've got work to do with your board, but that's within your control. You can either make that happen or you don't. It may not be within your control to retain students who move and so forth. So you're really very vulnerable, as Peter pointed out, to headcount. With 16 kids, the school works, but it can't pay off $150,000 worth of debt. With 20 kids, the school works and has a reasonably good chance of paying off its debt in 1 year, maybe, or at most 2.
When would they know headcount for the next fiscal year?
Well, usually by the end of in the spring, IEP meetings will be concluded by the spring.
Like April?
Yeah, April, May. We've turned down students already for enrollment because we're at capacity.
And let's keep in mind, these creditors are not people who go away. It's the IRS and people like that. Yeah.
With each student, do you add staff? Is there an
Sorry?
added staff cost for each student?
Sometimes, yes. It depends on the level of disability, but yes.
The budget that was prepared shows a appropriate increase in staff to accommodate the increase in the student
I saw
count.
that. Right.
If you lose a student, though, through the year, do you maintain that current staffing level, or do you have to adjust the staffing level?
More than likely the layoff, but we'd also wouldn't do it immediately because there's people, students in the wings, people asking about enrollment. So like, one kid probably means one staff.
Is there a motion?
I do have.
Yes.
We can either do a motion. I have a question though.
Yes.
Just, and not to disagree with the importance of diversity in the board. Having, served on a private nonprofit preschool board, recognize the challenge in getting diversity, disinterested folks to serve in that capacity. And so when I think about a board of 5 people overseeing the Essex Town School District of $22 million budget, and recognizing there are far more capacity within the administration, I feel a little bit certainly appreciative of the fact that the chair and the treasurer are no longer in their current roles, of the procedures you seem to have laid out, the policies you've laid out. So at least personally for me, not having expanded your board, but having solidified your procedures, your process, and your policy, with clarity around roles and responsibility, and, arm's length transactions happening and regular reporting. For me, not expanding your board would not be a deal breaker, and I don't know the consensus of the board, just recognizing the limitations and the challenges and doing that in a small nonprofit. So that doesn't diminish the responsibility of oversight of the board, and the recognition where you don't have the expertise that you seek it, however you go about doing that. And I think you've done that in bringing in a new treasurer and in a CFO and in other ways. So I would just say, I think for me, the additional body or diversity disinterested party is an ideal, more so than the importance in seeing these policies adopted and the procedures that go with them and the benchmarks for 2 signatures and the things that we've spoken about that are practice that might diverge from ideal. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Emily, have you found the renewal date?
I've not found the date, but I've confirmed that Inspire is not up for renewal before the end of this year. There's a large group of schools that's sort of a backlog, and they're not among that group.
Okay, thank you.
John, I'd make a motion
Yes, please.
that we table the item till April, our April meeting, provided that we get a written update from the full board by January 1st.
So it's been moved that we table any further action until the April meeting of the board, April 2020, and that the school provide to this board in time for its January meeting, and an update on financial circumstances and on governance and oversight. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Are there questions or comments about the motion? Are you ready for the motion? Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. So I would encourage you to be in touch with us in December and just have a dialogue with us about what are we going to be looking for. It should be pretty clear. I could say, Mr. Bandler, that the financial reports you presented to us were very, very difficult to follow. I think it's probably a matter of how Excel spreadsheets got translated into PDFs. The titles were confusing. Many of us had to struggle to follow them. So if you would address that, if you know what I mean, if you don't know what I mean, let's take it offline and I'll clarify for you.
If we could just get the source, Excel, that would be perfect.
Yeah.
No, Excel, yeah.
But it needs to be self-sufficient. Let's not get into the details of it, that's a ways off, but higher quality information would be, or more easily accessible would be useful. And then, of course, from you, Mr. Chairman, an update on what you have done in January and what you foresee doing through the rest of that school year. We thank you all three for the long drive, for being here and being available. We'd like to see you in April.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we'll just keep plugging along because we have some resource people here from the agency who are available to us for the work in front of us. Item K is the approval of the renewal of the approval for general and special education independent schools. First being the Compass School, with which you have some familiarity. And also, I should say, and we also wish to discuss, tell me, what are the other two schools?
East Meadow and Long Trail.
Okay. Let's address Compass and East Meadow is on the list.
East Meadow is sort of intertwined with Long Trail.
I think East Valley.
East Valley,
Was
Bill.
that one of them?
East Valley. Is that correct? East Valley.
That's correct.
And Long Trail?
And then there's East Meadow and Compass.
Right.
Okay.
So let's start with Compass, which is before you on the agenda. Emily, do you and your colleague, if that is a colleague, wish to come to the table to be available to provide information?
I'd like to just quickly introduce you to Rachel Smith, who is our new Assistant Attorney General. It's her third day on the job, so we're not going to have her come up to the table. Rachel is filling a position, some of you knew me in that position. It's interesting, it's shared between the Agency of Education and the Attorney General's office.
Well, that's what,
but she
is that what you
sits-
used to have?
She sits at AOE with us each day. So I thought she'd like to see your meeting as part of her
Well,
orientation
We
week.
welcome you here. We'll look forward to grilling you the next chance we get.
I'm never going to bring her again.
So, board members, you've seen the recommendation, the Secretary's recommendation with regard to the Compass School. Thank you. Do you have questions? Is there a motion? How do you wish to proceed?
I have a general question in regards to just the non-compliance regarding documentation. That's been kind of a repeated issue on this report, these student reports. Is there any better way we can address that, or can it be a better address?
My opinion on that is consistent thing that we want to highlight. There's some complexity of documentation, especially this process. And I think it would be pretty much the same in a public school setting as well. It's a challenge to comply with the current regulations and from a documentation standpoint.
Yeah. This is related to the broader issue
Yes.
that's been floating around, so it's not specific, it's across the
I
board.
am not surprised to see it routinely found as part of this issue.
And it may be mitigated some by Act 173.
Perhaps, yeah, I think we're certainly trying to simplify that process.
right.
And,
So, yes, Bill?
A related question that enters into the Long Trail and East Meadow School thing is both of them had recommendations that it relieves a majority of concerns that are in the rules. Well, I didn't know we went by majority. You either had to do it or you didn't. And so some clarification on the interpretation of that would be good, because the problem here is that we have two schools that both alleviate the majority, but they're very different.
Let us
Let's
take
focus
those
on
schools up. I'd like to take each school up separately, please.
Sure.
We're talking about Compass at the moment. So further to Compass, questions or comments? Is there a motion?
I'll move approval of the Compass School, and having been on the review team, I guess, as recommended by the secretary.
It's been moved to approve the Secretary's recommended action. Is there a second? Moved and seconded. Do note that the Secretary's recommended action does incorporate the language that you adopted at your last meeting, which was taken from the report of the review team. Further discussion? You ready for the vote? Those in favor of approving the Secretary's recommended action with regard to Compass School, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The board has approved the Secretary's recommended action with regard to Compass. The other one is,
East Meadow. That one.
thank you. This recommendation does not have any unusual conditions. It's just the usual paragraph about reporting promptly within 5 business days.
The approval's shorter.
Yes, it is. And is there a question or concern about that?
I'd make a motion, then, if not.
Please do.
That we adopt the secretary's recommendation and approve the license.
It's been moved that we adopt the Secretary's recommendation. Is there a second?
Could we just clarify for which school?
This is for East Meadow.
Okay.
So perhaps there could be an explanation as to why this approval is for only 2 years as opposed to the standard 5. Emily, do you have an explanation for that?
I'm making sure that I'm looking at the right East school, if
Yeah.
you'll pardon me for 1 minute.
Hmm?
I made a note inside of.
Is there a note?
No, I made my own note.
Oh, good.
Primarily, it's the special ed again. It's,
Yes.
but there was services that clearly didn't match IEP.
So if you'll look on page 8, I usually find that the section that's called notes on evidence
Yes.
is helpful because
Right.
that's where agency staff characterize what they found. There are slightly more serious findings here. I'll call your attention to East Meadow's file showed only 1 IEP that appeared to be current, valid, and reflective of the student's current placement. You won't see that kind of finding in the longer approvals. It was, it fell in that place on the spectrum of concern.
So the school is more acutely out of compliance with desirable practices than other schools, and so the remedy or the response has been to say, we're going to put you on a short leash, presumably with the intent of stimulating corrective action. Yes, Kim?
How does that reconcile with the LEA's responsibility for IEPs and placements?
This review is almost duplicative of the monitoring that the agency does as the SEA of RSUs. They receive robust special education program monitoring that is on a separate track from the independent school approval process.
But how can the public school be the oversight as they send their students out to these private schools if those private schools are not complying with the IEP requirements?
So actually, the onus on that one, I believe, is the public school, because they do a change of placement meeting at the public school where the public school special educator would put into the IEP the change of placement. And then the IEP goes with the child to the independent school.
So we think it's likely that the public school didn't do their part?
If they didn't do it then if I was the special educator receiving the child, then I would hold an additional meeting to write the change of placement in. But it's typically done at the
Yeah,
district level.
we understand.
It varies greatly from system to system. A more well-articulated, I'll say, systems, including their independent school partners, they might be using an information system where this is tracked very closely, and that the district, the LEA, can monitor that paperwork very closely. In smaller organizations, it really requires, like, as in this case, a physical inspection of the records on site. But we would capture it as part of this process, but then also, as Emily alluded to, there's a monitoring process, which really would then focus on the LEA's responsibility to ensure any place that student goes has sufficient documentation in place to provide those services. So this catches it on one level, but we get involved with the technical support and the guidance function through the monitoring.
Yeah. I just want to feel comfortable that we're not, that we're consistent on what we're saying yes to if the documentation isn't there. Almost like, everybody's responsible, it sounds like, for having it be current.
Absolutely.
And
But we,
present, and if
you're-
there's a chronic situation where that isn't part of their practice, that
Right.
is something, I think, to be cautious of, and maybe that's why the shorter timeframe.
That's
This looks
correct.
like the kind of thing that would be a finding if the LEA were monitored this year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so I mean, from your standpoint, you have our technical team who does these sort of reviews recommending to me that this should be a shorter time frame based on their understanding of all those things. So
Yeah.
you should have some confidence that they're looking at those things consistently.
And that doing so puts a tighter timeframe on getting them compliant, gives them the warning, but doesn't put at risk the ability for the LEA to be placing students, because that would challenge capacity.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
I just want to make sure I'm like taking it all the way through my
Yep,
thinking.
yep.
Good.
And understanding our responsibility in it.
And if I could draw your attention to that same paragraph, the end of it is a happier ending, if you will. They found the documentation, it's in place now. It wasn't ready and
Okay.
there as it should have been on the first review.
I'm happy to see shorter recommendations in these cases. It gives me some confidence that the agency's looking at them and making, rather than us have to backtrack from 5 years to 2 years, I'm really pleased to see a
Okay.
2-year limit here. It really gives me some sense that the agency's doing their due diligence.
Great, good, thank you. Is there further discussion?
I just have one more
Okay.
question. I don't, Morrisville, okay, I can't think of which SU or SD that is, but does that then
Memorial South.
trigger sort of a closer look at that public entity to see, does any of this inform where you go next in
It will inform the
monitoring that?
team, because we have cross-pollination
Yeah.
within our team, but
Okay.
your actions here don't trigger anything on the monitoring end. But our team has that centralized view of
Yeah.
the
Like,
ecosystem.
okay, we've
Yeah.
got like
Yeah.
a
And
private here that's
just
maybe
a-
not compliant, it might not be their fault, and what is the public doing in their record keeping? Okay.
And just a word of caution, the location of one of these schools, depending on how specialized the service are, might bear on the student's placement where they're coming from, and it might not. They might be from other
Right.
areas.
The school's located in Memorial South, but the sending
It
districts
could be anywhere. Okay, understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you ready for the question?
Was there a second?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Oh, okay,
There's
okay.
There are many seconds. Enthusiastically supported.
Wow.
Any
A
minute.
second and a third, then.
So, are you, then, the question is, shall the board endorse the secretary's recommended action with regard to East Meadow School? Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
The ayes appear to have it, the ayes do have it, and the motion is passed. Now we will take up the two schools that you moved from the consent agenda, East Valley and Long Trail. Let's take them one at a time. Go ahead. Bill, I believe you have some concerns about the Long Trail approval.
And Mr. Chair, just before we go any further, I just want to declare that I, at one time, attended Long Trail School. I don't have any association with the school beyond that, but if any board member has a concern, I'm more than happy to recuse myself from the discussion.
Does any board member have a concern? No.
Well, I have a concern, we may be running out of members. They're located close to my hometown, and I have some professional, minor business dealings with them. They rent some facilities from us occasionally, things like that. I don't have any personal fiduciary
Yeah.
interest in it, but I just wanted to declare that. If anyone has any
Thank you
concerns
for-
with that,
Thank
it's
you for
really
declaring
negligible,
that.
but.
Does anybody have a concern about Mr. O'Keefe's concern?
No.
Good. Then you may all proceed. So the question before us is, shall we approve the Secretary's recommended action with regard to Long Trail School?
I say yes for discussion, yes.
It's been moved. Oh, is there a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that we should approve the Secretary's recommended action with regard to Long Trail School. There appears to be some discussion.
Okay, actually, I'm sorting out the East Meadows versus the East Valleys myself. East Valley was for 5 years, correct? And East Meadow was for 2 years.
Right.
And Long Trail is for 5. And I'd like to understand a little bit more what the difference is between those two, because they are both listed for the same deficiencies, and they both have alleviates majority of concerns. And so it appears to be an inconsistency. Now, there may be a very good reason for this difference, but it doesn't come through in the green sheets.
Yeah. From my perspective, the deficiencies aren't the same. And I'm focusing in on the special ed report in particular. I don't consider the deficiencies from Long Trail to be of the same magnitude. But I think that was the team's conclusion as well.
The interesting fact, the difference, if you will, if there is one with Long Trail, is their extra little something was about an extended period of negotiating written agreements regarding services with the sending schools. It looked like their negotiation period, which is usually, I think, early spring till the middle of the summer, ran over that expected period of time.
Would you say that the discrepancy, not the discrepancy, the difference between a 2-year recommendation and a 5-year recommendation is conscious and intentional?
I
It's
think
not-
as the
it's not like-
agency, we're trying to treat like situations the same. And so the recommendations from the team, it's helpful because they have the context of all the approvals they've seen recently, and you'll see the Secretary's recommended action is trying to treat like cases alike.
So it was, I don't want to sound like a lawyer, God forbid, but it was intentional, that one was a 2-year recommendation, one was a 5. It wasn't by accident that there's a discrepancy here.
Mr. Secretary, did you make an accident?
I did not, and I
Okay.
rely heavily on the team's report, which is their recommendation independent of my review. So that
Okay.
comes to me, I also make a judgment, but I try to also keep an eye on the consistency. But I think to Bill's observation, I would say there are some subtle, albeit there are differences between the team's review of the two schools.
Are you ready for the question? So the question is, shall the board concur in the Secretary's recommendation to approve renewal of the Long Trail approval for 5 years?
Just one other comment is, I would like for them to go back and try to be a little more explicit about 2 years, 5 years, and what the rules happen to be, knowing full well that it doesn't have to be slavish adherence, but at least some guidelines.
Yeah, and I would also point out, we do, as you've seen, as we put forward, or the team puts forward an initial recommendation, the school has the opportunity to respond to that. And in a case, I think with the 2-year approval, the school concurred with our recommendation that 2-year was appropriate in that regard. So it is also, we do solicit feedback from them as well, and I think it's a good point, Bill.
Are you ready for the question? Those in favor of approving the Secretary's recommendation signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. You approve the Secretary's recommendation with regard to Long Trail School. East Valley is the last of the 4 schools. Is there a motion with regard to East Valley?
I'll move the Secretary's recommendation.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the board approve the Secretary's recommendation with regard to East Valley School Academy. Is there discussion? Hearing none, are you ready for the question? Those are in favor of of approving the Secretary's recommendation for East Valley Academy, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. You've approved the Secretary's recommendation. Thank you, board members. I think that concludes our work for this morning. We're not bad. Lunch is available to us at 12:30. So you can stand at ease until that time. Maureen, where is it that we're going for lunch?
Should be on your itinerary.
Is it the middle room?
I think it's the main dining room across the.
Yeah.
So we are recessed
That's where
until
we were last year,
1:30
right?
back here.
I think it's part of that.